I call this joint hearing of the Subcommittees on Readiness and Sea Power Projection Forces of the House Armed Services Committee to order. We are here in honor and memory of the 7 USS Fitzgerald sailors, Shingo Douglas, Noe Hernandez, Nak Truong Hun, Xavier Martin, Gary Rame, Dakota Rigsby, Carlos Victor Subayan, and the 10 USS John S. McCain sailors, Kevin Bushell, Dustin Doyen, Jacob Drake, Timothy Eccles, Charles Finley, John Hoagland III, Corey Ingram, Abraham Lopez, Kenneth Smith, and Logan Palmer. And we are very grateful that today we have Ms. Rachel Eccles, the mother of Petty Officer Timothy Eccles Jr., is here with us today. Ms. Eccles, we send to you our deepest sympathies and profound sorrow for your loss and appreciation for your son's service to our nation. I want to welcome our members to today's hearing. And I want to especially recognize that we have with us the committee chairman, the Honorable Mac Thornberry. Chairman Thornberry has been the leader of our ongoing efforts to mitigate our military readiness challenges, and I want to thank him for his leadership and for being here today to hear about the challenges illuminated by the tragic collisions in the Pacific. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty from Connecticut and Congressman Rodney Davis from Illinois. I ask unanimous consent that a member who is not a member of the Committee on the Armed Services be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all subcommittee members and then full committee members have had an opportunity to ask questions. Is there an objection? Without objection, such members will be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes. As we begin today's unclassified hearing on Navy readiness, underlying problems associated with the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain, I have no doubt that our Navy remains the most powerful in the world. But these recent tragic events only reinforce our committee's concern about the depth of readiness challenges the Navy faces. I'm especially concerned about the shortfalls in the force structure and whether the sustained operational tempo of a reduced 277-ship Navy may have contributed to these events. I also believe that the first responsibility of the national government is to provide for the national security for our citizens, to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And that is especially true of our sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines. Therefore, it's our responsibility as members of this subcommittee to continue to better understand the readiness situation and underlying problems of the United States Navy, and then for us to chart a course which best assists the Department of the Navy in correcting any deficiencies and shortfalls. We now ask the senior leaders of the U.S. Navy and Government Accountability Office here with us today to be candid in your best judgment, advise us on the underlying problems associated with the USS Fitzgerald and USS John S. McCain and how to recover from these tragic events. This afternoon, we're honored to have with us Admiral Bill Moran, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Rear Admiral Robert Boxall, who is the Director of Surface Warfare, and Mr. John Pendleton, the Director of the Defense Force Structure Readiness Issues of the U.S. Accountability Office. I'd like to now turn to our ranking member, Congresswoman Madeline Badillo of Guam, for any remarks she may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Whitman, for agreeing to convene this timely hearing on the Navy readiness, particularly with regards to the 7th Fleet operations in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. Chairman Whitman and I recently returned from Japan, where we visited and met with Vice Admiral Sawyer and saw the damage to the USS Fitzgerald firsthand. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Admiral Moran and Boxall, I appreciated our meeting earlier this week, and I look forward to continuing our discussion. Mr. Pendleton, thank you as well for your time and your work on this subject, as it is critical in aiding our oversight mission on this committee. The recent mishaps with the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain resulted not only in significant damage to the vessels, but also the tragic loss of life of 17 American sailors. Earlier in the year, we saw 2 additional mishaps, avoidable as I understand it, also involving surface ships assigned to the 7th Fleet. While investigations into the specific mishaps are still ongoing, and the Navy is in the midst of conducting 2 separate comprehensive reviews of surface fleet operations, I am interested to learn of the initial findings and the foundational challenges that need to be addressed to reverse the concerning trend that we are seeing with the readiness of our forward deployed naval forces. Specifically, I am interested to hear what steps may be taken to ensure appropriate time is allocated for crew training and ship maintenance in the forward deployed naval forces model, and how the chain of command will be held accountable to ensure Navy standards are being met. In addition to the training and the maintenance time, I will be interested to hear how the Navy is investing in developing and utilizing next-generation training systems to maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness of this time. This committee and the Navy's military and civilian leadership owe it to our sailors to learn from these incidents and take appropriate actions to ensure the contributing factors are properly addressed. Points have been raised about how the forward deployed forces model in the Pacific AOR has both stressed existing resources and highlighted gaps and deficiency in the manning of our vessels, the training of our sailors, and the maintenance of the fleet. Understanding that a balance needs to be struck and a review of posture in the region is underway, let me note that I believe maintaining a forward presence in the Indo-Asia Pacific is critical to our security in the region. Whether it be for deterrence, power projection, humanitarian assistance, bilateral and multilateral exercises, or a myriad of other critical missions, the Navy is able to rapidly react to contingencies only with forward deployed forces. However, these missions and our credibility are undermined if we are not able to effectively manage and operate the fleet. The Navy's deployment of significant capabilities overseas didn't occur overnight, and the Pacific did not become a heavy traffic theater overnight. So I'm concerned that the request for resources and the strategic prioritization of where to spend these resources has not properly reflected the operations, the maintenance, and the training needs of the fleet. Finally, I'll conclude by stating that today's hearing and the Navy's ongoing investigations and reviews should be viewed as just the starting point. I hope that we will have a continuous dialogue between this committee and the Navy on the issues, the lessons learned, and specific actions that need to be taken to ensure the readiness of the surface fleet. I want to thank you and the witnesses, and I look forward to the discussion. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Badillo. We now will turn to the gentleman from Virginia and Chairman of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, Congressman Rob Whitman, for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. I want to welcome Admiral Moran, Rear Admiral Boxall, Mr. Pendleton, and want to thank you all for attending our hearing on this tremendously important issue. I again want to thank Chairman Wilson for offering to hold this joint subcommittee hearing today. It is of essence that we get to the bottom of this in the interest of our nation. I believe that we may arrive at some conclusions that require the joint efforts of both of our subcommittees, and I look forward to working with the gentleman from South Carolina to expeditiously resolve these potentially egregious underlying issues to our surface Navy forces. Before I proceed any further, I also want to recognize our special guest in the audience today, Miss Rachel Eccles. Miss Eccles' son, Petty Officer Timothy Eccles, Jr., lost his life on board the USS McCain just a few weeks ago. Miss Eccles, thank you for being here with us today and for the enormous sacrifice that you and your family have made for this country. We are here today to ensure that the Navy, yes. We are here today to ensure that the Navy and Congress learns from these tragedies and makes the necessary changes. I want you to be assured that your son's life, given on behalf of this nation, was not given in vain. Naval warfare is inherently dangerous. As we continue to review the recent collisions associated with USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain, it is important to note that even in a benign environment, we send our sailors into precarious and oftentimes deadly situations. Our nation asks much of our service members, and they never fail to deliver. I hope that today's hearing provides some positive steps forward to ensure that our sailors are provided the best training and the best ships to sustain their daily lives, and in time of war, prevail over our enemy. I think we can all agree that our nation failed these 17 sailors and their families with these tragic collisions. Last week, I led a bipartisan congressional delegation with the gentlelady from Guam, Ms. Bordallo, to visit the 7th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Sawyer, and the sailors homeported in Yokosuka, Japan. I was encouraged at their zeal and the overall tenacity of the fleet, even in the face of these difficult events. Nevertheless, I look forward to turning our attention to assess whether there are procedural issues that may have contributed to a degraded material and training readiness of our forces in the 7th Fleet. As the committee reviews the degraded state of the 7th Fleet, two things are painfully obvious. The material condition and operational readiness of the ships are significantly degraded and not acceptable. Of our large service combatants, the majority of forward deployed ships are not properly ready to perform their primary warfare areas. Overall, the negative trend lines associated with the operational readiness of our forward deployed ships are deeply troubling. These negative training trends clearly contributed to the lack of seamanship evident on board the USS John McCain and the USS Fitzgerald. As to the ships themselves, the material condition of the forward deployed ships suffer as Navy prioritizes operational deployments over maintenance and modernization. This maintenance and training model places sailors at risk and most likely contributed in part to the incidents that we have witnessed with the 7th Fleet. It is equally problematic that the Navy intends to increase the number of forward deployed ships over the next few years with no increase to the maintenance capacity in Yokosuka, thereby increasing the risk to the fleet and our sailors. This increasing reliance on forward deployed naval forces is a model that is not sustainable and needs to be significantly modified. We have also learned that many of the destroyers based out of Yokosuka are only supposed to be forward deployed for no more than 7 to 10 years. However, we know that the USS John S. McCain has been forward deployed to Japan for over 20 years. Further, the USS Fitzgerald, USS Curtis Wilbur, and USS Stetham have each been homeported in Yokosuka for well over 10 years. The Navy has proven that it cannot manage the requirements for forward deployed ships in the 7th Fleet with a fleet of just 277 ships. The ships in Yokosuka have been outside the continental United States for too long, and consequently, their material condition is in an unacceptable state. I remain convinced that one of the long-term fixes to this problem is to increase the overall force structure and build the Navy that our nation needs. A larger fleet would allow the Navy to place less strain on each available ship, which would reduce the chance that any sailor is placed in a high-risk environment. In the short term, I fully support the need to adequately fund training and, most importantly, provide the fleet the time it needs to complete required maintenance and training. I think there are a number of contributing factors that should be explored, including Navy training models, impacts associated with the cannibalization of other ship parts, overall funding requirements associated with ship maintenance, and the incredibly high operational tempo endured by the fleet, specifically in the 7th Fleet area of responsibility, and also the operational failures that have occurred with our surface fleet. Each of these areas deserves additional assessment. The forward deployed Navy model is rife with risk, and this risk will increase in the future. The Navy needs to offer an alternative model that meets the nation's need at a reduced risk to our sailors. I thank Chairman Wilson for working with the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee on this important issue, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Rob Whitman. And now for the gentleman from Connecticut and ranking member of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, Congressman Joe Courtney, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Admiral Moran, Rear Admiral Boxall, and Mr. Pendleton for your testimony today. And I'd also like to recognize Ms. Eccles for being here today and putting a human face on the subject that we're talking about here today, and really representing the other families. And that's an important contribution that's being made here today. So thank you, Ms. Eccles. The circumstances that bring us to today's hearing are painful and tragic. As our lead witness today, Admiral Moran, pointed out in his order to the Navy's Fleet Forces Command dated August 24, 2017, in the span of 65 days, 17 sailors were lost in ship collisions and accidents on naval vessels. These were not, as he pointed out, limited occurrences, but part of a disturbing trend of mishaps in the Asia-Pacific region that since January has involved the USS Antietam, the USS Lake Champlain, the USS Fitzgerald, and the McCain. To put that in perspective, these heartbreaking casualties are more than the number of service members that we have lost in the Afghanistan war zone in 2017. Two of those sailors are from my state of Connecticut, Sonar Technician Second Class Nap Trung Wen of Watertown, Connecticut, and the congressman from that community, Congresswoman Esty, is with us here today, and Electronics Technician Second Class Dustin Doyen from Suffield, Connecticut, in the northwestern portion of my district, was lost on board the USS John S. McCain. Their families in the entire state of Connecticut are mourning the loss of these two patriots and are intensely watching the response of the Navy and Congress to fix this disturbing trend. Several reviews by the Navy and the Secretary of the Navy are underway right now to dig deep into this disturbing trend. I applaud those efforts, and I think I speak for all my colleagues today that we expect the Navy to be fully transparent with our panels as these efforts move forward, and that we will convene again as many times as needed to provide support to fix this problem. Indeed, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 13 of the U.S. Constitution is very clear. It is Congress's duty to, quote, provide and maintain a Navy, which certainly means a Navy that is well-equipped, well-trained, and adequately manned. What does seem to be clear at this early stage is these incidents are a glaring manifestation of the sharply increased demand being placed on our forward-deployed Navy vessels, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, and the declining readiness of these forces. We ask these forward-deployed ships to do difficult work, which is oftentimes not well understood by the public at large. For instance, prior to her collision, the USS McCain conducted a highly visible freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. Likewise, the Fitzgerald was a pivotal player in providing needed presence in response to Kim Jong-un's recent threats and missile tests. Simply put, these are not the kinds of ships and crews that we can afford to lose to preventable mishaps. As my colleague, Mr. Whitman, correctly pointed out, one obvious response to this high operational tempo is to grow our fleet and shorten the backlog of repair and maintenance for the existing fleet to take the pressure off the heel-to-toe operations of our forward-deployed ships in places like Yokosuka, Japan, and Rota, Spain. These two committees, I would note, have pushed more aggressively on a bipartisan basis to add funding to ship construction and readiness than any other entity in the Congress. This year's House NDAA plussed up these accounts significantly above the White House's budget that was submitted last May and passed with the biggest bipartisan vote since 2008. We will have more work to do to complete the 2018 process, and I am sure this hearing will increase the members' determination to get the best outcome possible. But today is not just about resources. It's also about whether Navy systems and policies need to be realigned to improve readiness. Unfortunately, concerns about systems and policies are not new. As the GAO has repeatedly reported over the last several years, and as our witness today will discuss, a growing number of our forward-deployed vessels are operating without the certifications expected of a ship heading out to deployment. Unfortunately, this trend has worsened since the last report in 2015, and this needs to be corrected. Similarly, in 2010, the Navy conducted a review by Vice Admiral Philip Belisle, which outlined shortfalls and concerns about surface force readiness that are strikingly relevant today in looking at these incidences in the larger state of Navy fleet readiness. One of his priority recommendations includes clarifying Who in the chain of command specifically has the ultimate say in whether a ship is manned, trained, and equipped to the level needed to safely do their job before being sent out on deployment? To put it another way, the certification process, which covers key competencies in seamanship, surface warfare, ballistic missile defense, to name just a few, need to be reviewed and approved by an accountable decision maker. Unfortunately, this recommendation raised by Vice Admiral Boxall has not been addressed in the 7 years since his report came out. We expect a lot from the Navy, and with good reason. Our sailors are the best in the world, and the sight of a U.S. Navy vessel in a foreign port or operating in international waters sends a powerful message of protection for a rules-based order in the maritime domain. And those sailors do what they need to do to keep the peace in the sea lanes of the world's great oceans free and open. In return, our sailors and families should expect that their leaders who send them out to sea have done all they can to provide the tools, resources, and training they need to conduct their work safely and return safely. I hope today's hearing will focus on the steps that the Navy will take to fulfill that expectation and what it needs from us here in the Congress to get it done. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Joe Courtney. Admiral Moran, we now turn to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be short. I want to be very clear that no matter the circumstances, the operating environment, or how strained our force might be, we should not and cannot have collisions at sea. Fundamental professional seamanship is the foundation for safe operations around the fleet. And all of the marvelous technology, the magnificent hardware that we put together in these ships, and the power of our weapon systems are meaningless without well-trained, skilled, patriotic, and experienced sailors who are well led. You have my promise that we will get to the bottom of these mishaps. We will leave no stone unturned. We will be accountable to you, to our sailors, and to the American public. Like you, our Navy stands with Miss Rachel Eccles and all of our Navy families with hearts broken, but determined to investigate thoroughly all the facts, to get at the root causes, to address contributing factors, and to learn so that we will become a better Navy at the end of this. We have an absolute responsibility to keep sailors safe from harm in peacetime, even as they prepare for war. Mr. Chairman, although we are 20 feet apart, there is no gap between what we need to do from here on out. Admiral Boxall and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral. We now turn to Mr. John Pendleton from the Government Accountability Office for your opening comments.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Wilson, Chairman Widman, Ranking Members Bardillo and Mr. Courtney, Chairman Thornberry. Thank you very much for having me here today to summarize GAO's past work on Navy readiness. Unfortunately, grim circumstances do bring us together. Mr. Chairman, I don't know what specifically caused the accidents, but I do know the Navy is caught between an unrelenting operational demand and a limited supply of ships. The Navy's been warning for some time that they've been keeping a pace that is unsustainable. Our work has confirmed the difficulties, and our reports have shown it. However, our body of work has also spotlighted risk associated with the way the Navy is managing the demands on it. Some of these risks present significant challenges in the building blocks of readiness, training, and manning and maintenance. Just over 2 years ago, we published a report warning about the increased reliance of overseas basing of ships. In that report, we found that ships based in Japan did not have dedicated training periods like U.S.-based ships. Their aggressive deployment schedule gave the Navy more presence, it's true, but it came at cost, including detrimental effects on ship readiness. In fact, we were told that the overseas-based ships were so busy that they had to train on the margins, a term I'd not heard before. And it was explained to me that meant that they had to squeeze training in when they could. Given the concerns, we recommended to the Navy carefully analyze the risks that we're mounting, especially given the plan to increase overseas basing in the future to meet the demands. I think it's important to note that the Department of Defense, on behalf of the Navy, wrote the response to our report, and they concurred with the report and our recommendation for the most part. And I think their response is instructive. And I'm going to read a short passage, please. We assess that Navy is well aware of risk associated with increased reliance on overseas home porting. The decision to accept these risks was ultimately based on the operational decision to provide increased presence to meet combatant commander requirements. Mr. Chairman, I fear this was a bad gamble in retrospect. In preparing for this hearing, we followed up on that work and learned a couple of things that concerned us. First, the Navy had told us that they planned to implement a deployment schedule for the overseas ships that would allow dedicated training. As of this hearing, they have not yet done that. They have a notional idea, but it's not yet been implemented. The second thing we learned was that training certifications, this is the way the Navy periodically determines that its crews are proficient in everything from seamanship, driving the ship, to warfare areas, were being allowed to expire at, frankly, an alarming rate. In 2015, looking just at the cruisers and destroyers, all of the certification areas, about 7% of those were expired. By the late June of this year, that number was up to 37% expired, a more than five-fold increase. Manning has been a persistent challenge for the Navy. Navy had a study in 2014 that indicated that sailors, on average, were working well over 108 hours a week. The Navy concluded at that time that this was unsustainable and could contribute to a poor safety culture. Maintenance is also taking longer and costing more due to the pace of operation. Ship deployments have often been delayed, although Admiral Moran told me before the hearing that, we've been keeping deployments shorter lately. But deployments have been extended, and then the ships have more problems when you bring them in. And the shipyards have trouble keeping pace for a number of reasons, which I think many of you are aware of. At this point, the lost operational days, because of the maintenance delays, number in the thousands. And having two destroyers out of service due to the recent mishaps is not going to help rebuild readiness. In fact, I think the Navy's treading water at this point in terms of readiness rebuilding. Mr. Chairman, GAO has made 11 practical recommendations to the Department of Defense to help guide the Navy and all the services toward improved readiness. DoD and the Navy have concurred with our recommendations generally, but to date have partially implemented only one. Several of the recommendations are focused on crafting a comprehensive readiness rebuilding plan that balances resources with demands and is transparent about what it will cost and how long it will take. We've also made recommendations specific to the Navy that are directly relevant to today's conversations, particularly in the areas of analyzing the risk associated with overseas basing and reassessing the workload that sailors actually face and using that to decide how many people to put on the crew. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I should acknowledge that we did all of this work because this committee requested that we do so. Thank you for your foresight, and we are honored to assist the committee in its oversight going forward. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Pendleton, we all appreciate the Government Accountability Office for your independent professionalism. It's particularly important to me personally. I have a son serving in the U.S. Navy, and your recommendations are so important for the health and safety and protection of the American people. Additionally, I particularly appreciate that a report was presented as a report to congressional addressees on June the 14th, which highlighted the issues of readiness just 4 days before the Fitzgerald incident. And so your efforts just could not, and your organization's efforts could not be more timely, and they're greatly appreciated by all of us. The GAO statement today that you have provided indicates that the expired training certification is provided by the Afloat Training Group for cruisers and destroyers home ported in Japan had increased fivefold since the 2015 report, from 7% expired to 37% expired in June of this year. Again, the month of the incident. Mr. Pendleton, can you explain the sharp trend of the training certifications since your report? What are the GAO's observations, and what is happening with our forward deployed forces?
Sir, we updated that information in preparation for this hearing, so we've not been back out to talk to the fleet about them. We did gather that information when we did the work a couple of years ago, and we asked for it to be updated, and the Navy provided it. And when we looked at it, we saw that, again, if you imagine all of the 11 ships based in Japan, 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers, and then 21 or 2 certification areas, when you look at the ones that were red, that they were expired, it had grown to 37% of all those little blocks, if you imagine it being red. Another thing that concerned us is there were specific areas that were even higher than 37%, and one of those was seamanship. 8 of the 11 ships had expired certifications for seamanship as of late June, and there were some other areas as well that were sharply lower than you would hope to see.
And again, I want to commend you. The analysis that you did is going to be so helpful to us, and then the actions needed to address the mission challenges are real world. And it's just, again, reassuring as a member of Congress, but as a parent. Thank you for what you're doing.
Mr. Wilson, if I may, that the report that you held up is a compilation report, yes, and it is designed to identify what we believe is the major challenges facing the Department of Defense. I think what's significant about it is we led with readiness rebuilding. That really, we think, is one of the priority areas the Department needs to focus on.
And you also provided extraordinary insight in regard to health care being provided to our military personnel. It has, I urge all members of both subcommittees and the full committee to get a copy, and it's really very helpful.
Thank you, sir.
Admiral Moran, obviously the trend is so significant, and I appreciate your heartfelt statement earlier. Can you help the subcommittees better understand the issues? I'm trying to figure out how our most forward deployed ships are apparently not being held to the same standards as the rest of the fleet. Who certifies the ships home ported in Japan?
Mr. Chairman, the certification is done locally by the operational commanders in Japan. So it starts with the commanding officer of the ship that makes a request for waivers or to extend their certification. It goes to his direct in the chain of command, who's the Desron commander, and that is worked out then above his level with the 1-star, 2-star commander of the task force in Japan, as well as the 7th Fleet commander, ultimately makes that decision. And so there, if I could, when someone is expiring on a certification, they are required to put a risk mitigation plan in place and request the waiver. And once the risk mitigation plan is approved in the chain of command, then they are allowed to operate along those certifications. So while the certifications are expired, there is a risk mitigation plan for each one of them. But to your point, and to the point that the GAO has thoughtfully put out here, is the trend of the number that we're asking for waivers is increasing at an alarming rate, one in which ought to give us all pause for just how hard we're driving the crews in 7th Fleet, changing schedules, delayed maintenance, and additional missions that they've been asked to perform are making it more difficult to get the ship and the command, which is called the Afloat Training Group in Japan and Westpac, on board the ship to do the certification at the right time before it expires. It's not an indication necessarily that they're not qualified to do those missions or those certifications.
And what is the role of the Afloat Training Group and with certifications?
I'll let Admiral Boxall address it. He's got direct comms with that group.
So, sir, the Afloat Training Group is how they're the senior sailors, usually at the senior enlisted level, who go out and are experts in each area of those specialties, the 21, 22 mission areas that the GAO mentioned. Those sailors that do that work for us generally need the time to go do that. And so these sailors will go out and they'll observe operations. There's a series for each one of those those certifications. You know, 0 might be making sure the training is there. Step 1 might be to make sure that the team knows how to do the basic drill sets, to an assessment in a phase 4. So if they don't meet all 4 of those phases, they do not get the certification.
And what would be their professional skills and training?
So they are usually assigned to ATG, a float training group, only after demonstrated fleet performance. So these are our best of our sailors. We look throughout the fleet that are, you know, and so one may be a bosun's mate for deck evolutions, for example, or a quartermaster for navigation, or an electrician for engineering, those types of sailors.
And these are extraordinarily important people. And are they fully staffed to perform their duties?
The answer is they are not fully staffed to their. So in Yokosuka, for example, there's 2 afloat training group areas. One is in Sasebo, Japan, and one is in Yokosuka. The 2 together work together to try to help ships from both home ports meet their qualifications. We have put a lot of money into buying the manpower, buying the people we need to get those billets. We've increased from 120 up to 180. Unfortunately, they're only manned not quite to that level. Actually, they're missing about 30 to 40 folks on that team due to the fact that it takes many years to generate a E7 or an E8, that senior enlisted specialist, and the priority goes to putting those specialists first on ships and then out to the ATGs.
And as I understand it, they have 22 areas of certification. And is there, again, sufficient personnel with skills to really determine the level of certification?
So in a perfect planning world, the answer is we would. If we had all the people we expected and we had the time to do it, then we probably would. But the reality is that we're seeing is that because of these compressed timelines, they have to train in smaller and smaller periods, meaning we have to send those evaluators to different places to catch up with the ship. That's a very inefficient model, and it further exacerbates a challenging certification process.
And in line with that, is it normal to have a single mission area certification waived prior to deployment?
So we use the term, we create this risk area mitigation plan. Before a certification goes out of periodicity, because of all these challenges, they have the time to do it. Sometimes there's a specific piece of equipment. Sometimes it's an exercise that can't get done. And so those ramps have to be put in place for every certification. They are put in place by the commanding officer of the ship, through their commander, back to the surface force commander, and then that's reviewed as the operational chain of command.
And is this the same standard that's used in Norfolk?
The difference in Norfolk is that ships coming from the mainland United States, from the east and west coast, they work up together with an aircraft carrier, and the answer is no. They work a plan that gives a 36-month period to get those qualifications done, but it's a very regimented piece. All the ships come out about the same time. They go into a training period for about 6 months, basic, intermediate, and advanced, and then they work up together, deploy through the deployment, come back, and are prepared to surge if needed, and then they start the cycle again. That is the optimized fleet replacement plan.
And with the number of waivers being provided, say per ship, when does it become dangerous for personnel to be serving on that particular ship?
Well, sir, I think that is exactly one of the things that we're going to look very closely at in the comprehensive review, because we do have different models. Those ships forward that are in Yokosuka are closer to the operational areas that we deploy ships to. And so the trade-off of where is the operational risk too great is exactly something that the fleet commander's interest is focused on today, and we are looking at the comprehensive review to make a permanent process change.
And who in the chain of Navy chain of command grants the waivers?
So in the chain of command for a risk area mitigation plan is all those plans are approved by the Surface Force Commander. They're the man, train, equip person at Commander Naval Surface Forces, and they review all those to ensure that they can do everything they can to make that ship meet what it can do given the constraints of time or exercise or the equipment that's not available to help them achieve the certification.
And then finally, was the Navy leadership aware of so many forward deployed ships certifications being waived?
Sir, I think that's something that the comprehensive review will look at. Again, I defer to the fleet on this one because, and Admiral Davidson will certainly get to this as the United States Fleet Forces commander. But I think clearly this is an area that we have to get to the bottom of. Where is the right amount of risk given our over-focus on trying to achieve the mission?
Thank you very much. And I now will refer to the ranking member, Madeline Bardallo of Guam, and of course, the American people are so appreciative of the very patriotic, dedicated citizens of that very vital American territory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the military for providing the great security that they did for Guam during this exchange with North Korea. So thank you very much. It definitely is apparent that training and certification issues have been building for years within the forward deployed fleet. Now, I have this question for both Admiral Moran and Boxall. I'm concerned that there is a critical deficiency in the feedback loop. Are ship captains voicing their concerns regarding the readiness of their crews and the condition of their ships? If they are voicing those concerns, who is assuming that risk? And do you feel they have an adequate understanding of the risks they are assuming and how that impacts the sailors that are forward deployed? I'll start with you, Mr.
Yes,
Moran.
ma'am. It's a great question. First of all, it is the obligation of any commanding officer to voice concerns if they have them with respect to the responsibility that they have, the obligation that they have to protect the safety and well-being of their crew. It is not unusual at all for a CO to express their concerns when there are manning issues or training issues, resourcing issues, and those conversations happen on the waterfront all the time. What I think has happened here, though, to I think Chairman Whitman's point, is we have allowed our standards of the numbers of certifications to grow, our standards to drop as the number of certification waivers have grown. While not against the rules, they are below the standard that we should accept. And to Admiral Boxall's point earlier, these are the kinds of things that the comprehensive review that Admiral Davidson is going to undertake to look at is where is the acceptable standard for the number of certifications? And then how are those concerns by commanding officers being transmitted up the chain of command, and what are they doing in response? Once the commander's senior approves the waiver, they are, in a sense, accepting that risk. They are allowing the ship to move with a greater number of waivers and a number of expired certifications. And so the responsibility of our fleet commanders and our commanders in the operational environment is to wake up every day, assess the environment, and assess the risk that they are taking from unit to unit across the waterfront. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've got a lot of learning to do on that front, to your very good question.
Well, thank you, Admiral. I think what I really would like to know, have these captains or commanders ever come to you with risks? Is there a list somewhere, or have they never said anything? That's what I would like to know.
Well, are you talking specifically Fitzgerald and McCain?
Yes.
Yes, so that's part of the
Or
investigation.
any ship, for that matter, but
Yeah.
especially, so you've never received any complaints or?
At our level, we would not necessarily receive direct from a commanding officer. There is a chain of command that runs through the operational chain to the surface force commander, and then it would come to us if it were something that they needed additional resourcing that they couldn't provide for themselves.
I understand the protocol, you know,
Yes.
that the commander should do this, but I just wondered, are they doing it, or are they just avoiding some of these things?
I think as Admiral Boxall described, they are following the process that requires the chain of command to get involved in the risk mitigation process and the steps to mitigate any certification that is about to expire. So they are all taking on that risk by mitigating it with very specific steps that are outlined that they have to follow through on.
So, Admiral Boxall, do you have a list of some of these risks?
I can give you an example of the type of the mitigations that are in place. For example, as I described, Chairman Wilson, the individual steps that it takes. They may have 4 steps or 5 steps in a process of one particular qual. They may have, for example, they may need to go out and for a seamanship, they've achieved, the basic, the second part where they get to the point where they meet something they didn't have an opportunity to moor to a buoy, for example. That becomes a mitigation so that they do not certify, but they say, well, the risk of that ship going and doing a moor to buoy for what I want them to do probably isn't an issue, and therefore that's been addressed operationally by the commander. Now, to your question, whether or not the COs will tell us when we expect that, we train them to do that. We go through a lot of workups when our command qualifications almost exclusively put COs in a bad position where we have to ensure that they will tell leadership when they don't feel they can meet the demand. That's what we train them to do. Now, the question, if they're going to be doing an operational mission, our sailors are kind of conflicted because they want to do that mission. And so the question is do they feel it? Do they want to do that mission? Do they feel that's something I think the comprehensive review is going to get to. Do we have systems in place that accurately measure the risk independently, and the operational fleet commander ensures that due diligence has been done to the level of risk for the level of operation that they'll be doing? And that's what I think we're getting to.
See, thank you. I feel that, if maintenance and training and all of this is lacking, the commanders, the captains of these ships should be, letting everyone know about it, and certainly maybe we wouldn't be in this fix. The other question I have is, Admiral Moran, the need to grow the size of the fleet has often been a point raised when we talk about the Navy readiness. However, the Navy's proposal to grow to 355 ships would take decades to be realized, which means we have to make do with the size of the fleet that we have in the near term. With that in mind, what near and mid-term measures are being considered with respect to how we crew, train, and maintain the ships that we have today in order to rebuild and sustain readiness? How will the Navy prioritize missions, or in some cases turn down missions, so we don't put sailors at risk by running the fleet ragged without being properly trained and maintained?
Yes, it's a key question for Admiral Davidson's team is to assess how much operational tempo in places like Japan, Rota, Bahrain, where we have forward deployed forces, reaches a point where we can't do the maintenance and the training and have the appropriate amount of time left to do the operations. On forward deployed forces, like in Japan, the training is done while you're at sea operating on deployment, for the most part. There's not dedicated time, as the GAO pointed out, like we have back here in CONUS. So that's an issue that both chairmen have raised as a serious point that we have to study to make sure that when we build the model for how we maintain and operate ships in the forward deployed naval forces, we have sufficient time to do those things. The size of the force, of course, as I testified last February and March, does matter. But wholeness of the force matters just as much, because you could have a large force that is not whole and you're going to run into these problems. If maintenance takes longer, it disrupts the schedule. If the schedule is disrupted, it disrupts the ability to train. If the training is disrupted, you end up in these places you've described with expired certifications, so on and so forth. So we do have to look at this model from the ground up. But we also recognize part of the reason why we have FD&F forces is because we get 4 times the presence with those forces than we would if we had them all in CONUS. So, for example, the fact that we've got 1 carrier in Yokosuka, it actually gives us roughly equal to 16 carriers when we only operate 10. That's a big difference. Having 4 destroyers in Rota, Spain, operating off the BMD stations was the principal reason we wanted to put those forces forward, was to get more out of those ships and not have to rotate as many from CONUS to do those missions. So all of these things culminate with this notion that we we aren't big enough to do everything we're being tasked to do. And our culture is, we're going to get it done because that's what the Navy is all about. And sometimes our culture works against us. And I think we ask the sailors to do an awful lot, to your earlier point, and perhaps we've asked them to do too much. And that's what the comprehensive review will look at.
Well, thank you. I have just one quick final question for any one of you who'd want to answer. Would you say that sequestration might have had something to do with the lack of maintenance and the training and so forth, funding not being there?
I'm on record, ma'am, that is absolutely the case.
Right.
That, along with 9 consecutive continuing resolutions, and we're about to hit another one. Those budget uncertainties drive uncertainty into schedules, drive uncertainty into maintenance. Our private yards, our public yards, this is an issue across the board. So the most useful thing we could have out of Congress right now in terms of addressing a lot of our readiness concerns is stability in the budget.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the report. And I do want to say I had a nice conversation with Rachel before the hearing today. She's one brave woman. Thank you, Rachel, for being here with us, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bardillo. We now proceed to Chairman Rob Whitman.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson, Admiral Moran, Rear Admiral Boxall, Mr. Pendleton. Thank you for coming before us today. Thanks for your service, and thank you for your candor and frankness. It is critical for us to get to the bottom of this. Mr. Pendleton, I want to begin with you. In terms of the material and training readiness of our ships home-ported in Japan versus ships home-ported in the United States, is there a difference in levels of readiness? In which group of ships are more ready than the other?
The information that we have in the 2015 report that we weren't able to update shows trends, and the Navy calls them equipment casualties. It's broken stuff. Had basically been upward for both U.S.-based and overseas-based ships. The overseas-based ships casualty reports were, and again, that's equipment, was more steeply upward. But we weren't able to update that trend line since then. So I can't answer it since 2014 when our data ended.
But the recent data you have a lower state of readiness for forward deployed naval forces versus those in the United States.
We saw a more steep increase in breakdowns for the overseas-based ships.
Admiral Moran, do you agree with GAO's assessment?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I think this speaks to what you raised earlier in terms of the if we're not rotating those ships back, the older they get, the more care they're going to need. And that might be an indication, and it's part of what we're looking at in the comprehensive review, is these extended periods at FD&F having a detrimental effect and impact on their material condition the longer they go. And is the SRF, the ship's force, the maintenance force in Japan, have enough capacity to deal with the increased numbers we've put in FD&F Japan in the last 3 years?
Following up on that, in order to maintain overseas presence, will the Navy increase or decrease forward deployed forces, Japan and elsewhere?
Well, I think we have all taken a pause here for all the right reasons to figure out whether our current plan is the right plan. Okay. And we're looking forward to Admiral Davidson's report in 60 days to let us know whether we need to make adjustments to that plan.
Was the plan prior to this to increase or decrease that in the future?
The current plan, we just completed the 3rd DDG crew desk ship in Japan that was added to that force.
Okay.
And so I'm not aware of additional ones this year or next year.
The strategic laydown plan, as we bring in LCS and station and rotate them forward, will increase the presence. Okay. But again, that's with the existing strategic laydown plan. We are going to look at that, I'm sure, as part of this review. Certainly, how we do that is double-edged sword. We know it's harder, more expensive to maintain, but we need ships forward to be there, given especially the number of ships we have.
Gotcha. Very good. Mr. Pendleton, from a financial perspective, is it more cost-effective to home port ships in the United States or to forward deploy those ships?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, if you look at it on the margin it's marginally a little more expensive to have ships overseas. We did analysis to show that. I would caution against the rule of thumb not to differ with Admiral Moran, because I've heard this many times about you get 4 times more presence. That's true from a force structure standpoint, right? I mean, 1 ship can cover down on what 4 ships would do, but that's mainly because of the way they're deployed. And so essentially the U.S.-based, the OFRP model, the Optimized Fleet Response Plan model, has them going out 7 months out of every 36. FDNF ships are scheduled to go out 16 months out of every 24. I mean, there's a graph in our report that describes this. I mean, it's difficult to quantify the impact of that, sir.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. Admiral Moran, do you agree that if we had more ships in our Navy fleet, we could spread the workload more evenly? We wouldn't be pushed up against the demands and the stresses that happen when you have ships forward deployed for more than the planned number of years, extended maintenance periods, truncated training periods. Give me your perspective about how the number of ships we have today. And let me put it in perspective. If you go back to the 1980s, when we had a Navy of 600 ships, we had 100 ships forward deployed. Today we have 277 ships. We have 100 ships forward deployed. Give me your perspective about the size of the fleet in relation to where we are today with forward deployed naval forces.
Well, you just gave the answer for me, Mr. Chairman. I mean, that math is pretty hard to argue with. And while Mr. Pendleton and I have had this discussion, you can argue over the factors. You know, it's 4 times or 3 times. But the fact is, even with that, those ships are a lot closer to where we might have to fight by being there. And I think that's a value you can't put a times anything on. It's clearly, and the message that sends to our allies and partners in the region is vitally important. Yeah. That said, I think you made the point about if we're still operating 100 ships deployed today at a force that's 40+ % smaller than it was in the 1980s, it's actually the 80s and 90s. It is going to be a bigger stressor on that force. So, yes, I agree with you.
Gotcha. Mr. Whitman, may I add one thing?
Yes, please.
The Admiral makes a great point, and it's important to emphasize that the Navy doesn't create the demands. The Navy responds to the demands. They're being asked by the combatant commanders and the Department of Defense to fulfill those demands. So it's important to make that distinction.
Gotcha. Very good. Admiral Boxall, let me ask this. In order to get ships ready today to deploy, you spoke a little bit earlier about what they do for material readiness. And what we see is them going to other ships, cannibalizing parts in order to get ships ready to maintain that material readiness. Is cannibalization a systemic problem with surface ships? And is the root cause sufficient money to procure new parts or stocks of parts to make sure you have them on hand to keep up with routine maintenance or expected problems with wearing of parts and wearing of systems?
Sir, the cannibalization of parts off ships is something we try to avoid as much as possible, but there's a lot of reasons why we do it. Sometimes it's the availability of the part. Sometimes it's even when we have the money to buy the parts, we've had a lot of money restored in the last year, especially the 17 RAA, but it takes time to go buy that part. Some of these are made by very unique vendors, so there's some pent-up readiness, spare parts, sparing challenges out there, contracting time to do those things. So we are seeing some cannibalization increases. We're also seeing an increase in the C2, C3 CAS reps. That to everyone is kind of, C2 is where it becomes kind of a tension getter for an operational commander. C3 means there's a major issue on that ship we got to get to very quickly. There's kind of 2 reasons for that. One is the actual material readiness is degrading and we need to bring it to leaders' attention. The other reason is that in places where we're having a difficult time getting work done to repair these CAS reps in the yards because of the demand, the commanders are trying to boost the priority of their jobs to get them in because it's the best way they know how. That's a signal back to us also that says we got to get something right and get, not just because we want the reporting to be accurate. We don't want commanding officers, again, we challenge them with telling us when things are wrong, and when they do, they send the flare, and we expect them to do that. But if they're doing it because it's the only way they can get the response, then that's another issue. And this goes to the demand that we have specifically in SRF, Ships Repair Facility in Yokosuka Forward is probably the more significant example.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Whitman. We now proceed to Ranking Member Joe Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Admiral Moran, I guess one thing I think might be helpful for some of us anyway is just sort of walk through what the investigative process and reporting process is going to look like over the next, 60 to 90 to 120 days.
Yes, sir.
In terms of the various efforts that are underway.
So immediately after both collisions, any mishap, we stand up an investigative team. In the case of these two collisions in Japan, we put a dual-purpose investigation together that includes the normal safety investigation and the JAGMAN investigation. Those are privileged investigations. We do not share that information publicly so we can protect folks from being very open with us and giving us as much information as possible to determine the root cause. So those investigations are stood up immediately upon by the convening authority. The convening authority for Fitzgerald was the Commander 7th Fleet. The convening authority for McCain was Admiral Swift because of the other investigation going on and because we relieved the 7th Fleet Commander in the interim. So those investigative officers are usually, in this case, are both flag officers. They take a team to the site, to where the collision occurred or where in this case, both ships were brought back to a pier, one in Singapore, one in Yokosuka. And they go through every aspect of an investigation. It's a checklist of things you do. We added cyber to that checklist because of obvious concerns with the fact that everything we operate has a cyber component to it, networks, gear, radios, everything. And so we want to make sure we understand that is not, we want to eliminate that as a potential causal factor to a mishap. Those investigations can take a week, 2, 3 weeks, and a report is then passed to the convening authority. The investigation is not complete at that point. That convening authority then gets to endorse the report, ask additional questions, go review the following things. I'm not satisfied with X, Y, or Z. And then the investigating officer has to go back, look at those things, and provide an addendum to the report. And then when Commander 7th Fleet is complete with his endorsement, it gets passed to PAC Fleet. And in the case of Fitzgerald, that's where the current report and investigation reside with Admiral Swift. He then has a responsibility to look at the report for completeness and any findings of fact that he is unsatisfied with and wants further investigation, he can direct it in that endorsement. Ultimately, it comes to me, both of those investigations. So a lot of people think that once the investigating officer has submitted a report, the investigation is done, we should share that information. But I appreciate the opportunity to explain that the endorsement process is still part of the investigation because we could ask for additional investigations. So that's on the investigation side. That's the very tactical level. What happened to that ship? What caused that particular incident? The comprehensive review that we directed Admiral Davidson stand up 60 days was to go out and look at all the man, train, and equip functions across the force, but with specific focus on FDNF Japan because of these 4 mishaps that have occurred in the last year out there. To look for things like career path management, for are we doing the right training? Is the model for how we employ forces in FDNF the right model? Is the maintenance model that supports it the right model? All of those things we've kind of already talked about in this hearing. And then above that level, the Secretary is doing a strategic readiness review where he's going to look across the department at things that are policy related, resourcing related. Are we making the right choices? Do we need more guidance? And it will be a nice complement to the comprehensive review because it will look above where Admiral Davidson's looking. So we'll get a very strategic, operational, and tactical understanding of what has occurred, why it occurred, and then what are the things we're going to do to fix those issues. Does that help?
It is, thank you. And I think it's important just for the public and obviously the families to understand, again, the different steps. And I'm sure, the committees will be, following it like a box score in terms of, asking questions. In your written testimony, which I know you summarized, and we appreciate that, but you did make, I thought, a very powerful statement, which is that as follows: no matter how tough our operating environment or how strained our budget, we shouldn't be and cannot be colliding with other ships and running aground. This is not about resourcing, it's about safety, and it's about leadership at sea. And again, just to go back to the process we're in right now, that's really what the 60-day comprehensive report is really aimed at in terms of just, why is this a recurring event in this particular area of the world? Is that right?
Yes, sir. But I would also compliment GAO in this regard. Did I think they offer a pretty nice blueprint for some of the things we need to go look at in terms of trends? And what are those macro trends, and what do they imply about the force readiness in FDNF Japan across the fleet? So we'll get at some of those as well inside that comprehensive review. Right. But it is a key part of it is, do we have the right training in place for our commanding officers? Are they getting enough of what they should have to operate in waters that have become highly congested and contested in that region? And it's a lot busier than it was just 8 years ago. And so we need to review that, and we need to review the training. We need to review the career paths for our officers, our junior officers. And we need to make sure that we understand that we have the right manning models in place. And GAO calls this out in their report. About how we establish the work week and how do we respond to the manning profiles for those ships.
Thank you. Well, and again, I think that sort of follows up on what GAO sort of was asking for over the last couple of years as well. I guess one sort of footnote, I was wondering, what you would think about this in terms of that statement, which is that it is about leadership at sea, but it's also about leadership, I think, ashore as well, in terms of just, the way decisions are being made. And I have to say, going back to the Boxall report, which I'm assuming all the witnesses are pretty familiar with, I mean, that was sort of a key critique that Admiral Boxall had, which is that the lines are kind of blurred in terms of just dealing with some of the issues we're talking about here today. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to figure out who decides. When you have the certification issues that Mr. Pendleton described, who calls, time out and just says, no, that as persistent as the combatant commander's requests are, when does it reach a point and where does it reach the point where someone says, that's just not going to be deployed because it's not safe and it's not ready. So I'm assuming that that's also a part of the comprehensive review.
And I believe the Secretary is going to look at that in the strategic review as well for organizational C2, command and control. Who is responsible precisely for readiness and man training, equip, and operational demand in the Pacific Fleet? And how does that get balanced against the larger fleet that Admiral Davidson's managing out of Fleet Forces?
Because even today, I've been a little confused about who's the decision maker. Is it the operational commander, or is it the forces commander? And I think again, Admiral Boxall really, I think, nailed that pretty well in terms of just that being an issue that's got to be cleaned up. So, Mr. Pendleton, you described the trend of the increasing lack of certifications, which was kind of a top line in terms of the number of ships that are out there. Can you give us some more specific information regarding the Fitzgerald and the McCain? To what extent do they lack certifications?
I'd rather defer specific questions about the Fitzgerald and McCain. They did have missing certifications, as did most ships. I'd like to talk about the key warfare mission areas, though,
Sure.
and
Yep.
give the admirals a chance to comment on the specific ships with the ongoing investigations. I'm uneasy about that. I mentioned earlier that 8 of 11 seamanship certifications of the 11 ships in Japan were expired. There were others that had fairly significant expirations of 7 of 11 ships for fire support and surface warfare, and for undersea warfare, 8 of 11 ships had expired certifications. Some of those certifications were several months overdue. So when we looked at some of the basic certifications, the things you have to do to keep track of maintenance and anti-terrorism and communication, that kind of thing, those were better. They weren't great, but they were better. It seemed seamanship stood out as a problem area, and then when you got over into the warfare mission areas, the kind of things that you have to do together to be able to do the missions of the ship, that's when we started saying. Now, I presume that those are more complicated certifications to obtain. Honestly, I haven't been out to talk to them about it. Those were had a higher percentage of ships that had expired certifications.
Thank you. Well, again, I'm sure that my question is going to be asked at some point
Yes,
in this process because, and frankly, it's a question that needs to be fleshed out.
Yes, sir.
So, thank you. I yield back.
And thank you, Ranking Member Courtney, and truly an indication of how important this hearing is. Our love and affection for the 17 sailors that we've lost and others who were injured. We've been joined today, and we now turn to the full chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I just want to say I really appreciate the work of GAO as well as the work of these committee members and our staff on these issues. The leadership of the department in the last administration denied we had a readiness problem. They said we were just making it up. I appreciate the persistence, members on both sides of the aisle, in getting the facts, and certainly GAO has helped with that. Admiral Moran, I very much appreciate you and Admiral Richardson's commitment to get to the bottom of this matter. I looked a little earlier at your testimony from earlier in the year, and you highlighted the stresses and strains on the force based on the operational tempo, et cetera. You also testified that you thought that the deployed fleet was in pretty good shape. The ships here in the United States were really suffering. Based on what you know today, would you revise that assessment?
Mr. Chairman, so I promised you I'd be frank, and I will be. I personally made the assumption, I have made the assumption for many, many years, that our forward deployed naval force in Japan was the most proficient, well-trained, most experienced force we had because they were operating all the time. I made the assumption. It was a wrong assumption in hindsight. And so, obviously, at this point, I would tell you that what we send from CONUS to deploy, I would maintain my position in the hearing last February. Clearly, because the models are different and because the strain on the force in Japan is so evident to us today, we're going to have to get after that question. I don't know precisely. And I'm also very anxious to remind the committees that we have to get to the root cause of both mishaps before we can make a determination. But the trends that the GAO has pointed out, the trends that we are seeing in our reporting stats are concerning, and they do demonstrate a fraying of the readiness on the edges that we need to address.
Yeah. I just comment. I don't think we can look at this too narrowly. This is looking at the surface fleet, but we know we cannibalize submarines. We've got these problems in a variety of other problems. And the other services have it too, by the way, which is a more widespread problem. Let me just ask you this. We talk a lot about the stresses and strains on the people. How come the Navy has not asked for more people? Increase in strength.
Manpower, as you know, 3 years as a Chief of Naval Personnel, I've dealt a lot with the manpower issues. Manpower requires you to project at least 2 years ahead to be able to know if you're getting to the right numbers. And I don't want to bring this back to uncertainty in budgeting and resourcing, but it impacts our ability to assess the right number of people when we can't predict or project what we're going to be in 2 years. So it has an impact. We are always trying to catch up with manpower, and I think that's part of what Admiral Boxall described in the afloat training group. We bought the billets 2 years ago. But it takes time to fill those billets because we have to go find the right experience, the right folks that have operated and understand what the challenges are in building and attaining certifications. So manpower is a bit more challenging to get precise. And as you know well, manpower also costs an extraordinary amount of money, so we're always trying to dial it right. We are not getting it exactly right, but we're doing the best we can with the inability to project precisely where we would like to be in 2 years.
Okay. If you're going to be frank, you got to be frank with us and tell us where we complicate your life. With CRs and the Budget Control Act, you did that earlier, and I appreciate it, but don't hesitate to say where we're deficient. Let me just ask this, and it goes right back to something Mr. Courtney was talking about. Seems to me the hard issue is, and you talked about it for a commander in a ship, saying, okay, I've got these problems, I got to ask for a waiver, I have a risk mitigation plan. You and Mr. Courtney talked about it a little bigger, but what's going through my mind is, when do you and Admiral Richardson basically say to the Secretary of Defense or the President, we cannot do what you expect us to do, and to us? You said earlier, the culture works against us. It's true in every service. You salute and say, you give us a mission, we'll do it. I don't know if you have any comments on this, but what's going through my mind is, when does a service chief or vice chief say, we cannot do what you expect us to do with what you have given us?
Sir, well, there's one very good example of where we have done that in the past few years. You'll recall where we gapped carrier presence in the Gulf for several months. We've done that twice, and that was a recognition that we were going to overstress the force and weren't able. We were concerned about sticking to our plan in Optimized Fleet Response Plan, which was a 7-month deployment. We wanted to get there, and we wanted to maintain that. The world gets a vote. A lot of pressure came up. And we went down and argued why we thought we needed to stick to those 7-month deployments, and the Joint Force accepted those gaps. It was painful. It was a difficult message to send to the region, but it was necessary to be able to continue to try to reset the Navy.
We're going to stay after this, ma'am. We're going to stay after this. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mac Thornberry. We appreciate your leadership. We now proceed to Congresswoman Susan Davis of California.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our chairs who are up here today and really have provided a lot of good leadership of walking us through these issues. And thank you to all of you for being here, and to Ms. Rachel Eccles, thank you. Thank you for being here on behalf of 17 shattered Navy families who are grieving today. We appreciate that, and helps us to think about your son as well. I know that we've been talking a lot about all the problems that have been encountered, how tragic they are. But one of the things I wanted to ask very quickly was really about the heroism that was demonstrated on the ships as well. And I know, in having read almost that minute-by-minute account of what happened on the Fitzgerald, that there were specifically 2 sailors who were mentioned repeatedly for their heroism. Are they up for awards? Have those been submitted for recognition? What are we doing to really acknowledge the heroism as well?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question. There's a difference between heroic and valorous, and people often get confused by that. And it sounds like you're not, so I appreciate the fact that the question revolves around our sailors who operated that night, some who lost their lives, who gave their lives for others. It is a command's responsibility to initiate the recommendation for awards in any circumstance. So as you might imagine, right now their focus might be elsewhere, but we will get to those, and when they come forward, we'll do the appropriate recognition that comes from those recommendations. In addition to that, though, I think you also know that we posthumously advanced all 17 sailors to the next pay grade in recognition of who they could have been. So thank you for the question.
Sure, thank you. I wonder as well, we've been talking about whether or not the forward deployed model is sustainable. And the fact that it is used so much. I wonder, as you have looked at a whole host of different areas, if you're feeling comfortable yet kind of ordering those in terms of priority. Is it the training? For sure. That has to be different. One of the things that I recall reading with this is, I guess at one time it sounds like the initial training, sort of the foundational training, if you will, was much longer. And so that our sailors really, were intimate in many ways with the apparatus, with everything that they're asked to do differently. And maybe you can speak to that. People who know how to build computers obviously can respond to the needs of a computer a lot faster than those of us who just, use it to get our job done. And so is that true? I mean, is there a real difference in the time that's spent helping to familiarize our sailors with the ship, with what they work with? And on the other hand, then, it's driving under decent conditions that they also have to be aware of.
Yes, ma'am.
Where does that fit?
As we look toward, we are continually modifying our training methodologies, new technologies we have. I'm sure you've heard since the Belial report, we had taken a lot of our initial training away for our new commissioned officers. We used to have up at Surface Warfare Officer School in Newport, very long 16-week course. Since that time, we have restored 15 of those 16 weeks in either pre-division officer training when they first graduate from the academy or ROTC or whatever, and then another 5-week period, 6-week period afterwards. So we've restored a lot of that. We've got a lot of the same PQS personnel qualification standards that we require every person on every ship to go through. I do believe that we should be open to looking at all this as part of the comprehensive review. And Admiral Davidson, as a surface warfare officer himself, certainly understands that we've focused our training a lot on ship handling. These are very powerful ships. We want to handle them close to a pier where we need to be. We put a lot of money and time into bridge resource management, that team piece, the combat team and the bridge team working together. As we go forward, we will look and say, do we need to do more of that type of training vice the individual training? I don't know the right answer just yet. I'm open to the fact that we may have it wrong.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. I believe my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman Davis. We now proceed to Congressman Duncan Hunter of California.
Thank you to both the chairman and the ranking members for having this hearing today. Gentlemen, thank you for being here and for your service. And I'll just get down to brass tacks really quick. You had 7 ballistic you had 7 BMD ships forward deployed. You lost 2. What are you going to do in the meantime for those 2? What's going to fill that gap while they're getting repaired?
Admiral Swift has moved ship deployments and ships around within Pacific Fleet, which is our largest contingent of naval power. I can't talk about who and what and when, for obvious reasons, but he has what he needs to replace the BMD capability that he thinks he needs to have at this crucial stage.
So we know you had 7. 7 minus 2 equals 5. Are you planning on going back to 7?
Are we replacing the capability we need to do the operations we've been tasked to? The answer is yes.
Okay. Are you going back to 7 ships?
The 7 ships will be, yes, sir. We'll stay with 7 ships.
Okay. So you'll have 7 ships there.
Remember, 7 ships. Some are in maintenance, and some are. They're not always all at sea. So we're able to move some of those around to accommodate Admiral Swift's demand signal.
So you'll be replacing those two ships. You'll be replacing the capability of those two ships.
We'll be
So you'll have the same capability that you had beforehand.
Yes, sir.
How long will that take?
As long as it takes.
I mean, how long until that
Oh, I'm
capability gap is filled?
I don't have a specific answer. I can get back to you on that.
Okay. Next, I've been seeing some articles that said that surface warfare officer training was canceled, and I haven't gotten to the veracity of this. There used to be like a 6 or 7 month SWO school, and there's not now. It's DVDs and on the job training. Is that correct or no?
It is true at one point. Back in 2003, we initiated what we call computer-based training. That lasted about 5 years, 6 years, and then it was removed as a bad idea. For all the reasons it still sounds like a bad idea.
So if you don't mind stopping there, we have a virtual trainer in San Diego for one of the LCS variants that I went to, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and it's like basically being in a like an F-35 trainer or something, but it's the ocean and the whole bridge. Is that what you call computer training?
Absolutely not. The computer-based training that I'm speaking of are, think, PowerPoints on a CD.
Okay.
So that's what was kind of given to them because we took away their school. We said, go to the ships, do all your training there. As I mentioned to Ms. Davis, we have restored almost all of that timing. We do it in the fleet concentration centers instead of in Newport right now at the division officer level, and all other training is similar. But you bring up a great point. Our training for LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship, that we do in San Diego and Mayport we'll be doing is the best there exists that I've seen in surface warfare. And so I believe that we will look forward to, as part of this review, looking at where we can better use, and we already do use a lot
Let me interject. Now that you said that, there's two things. One is called the immersive virtual ship environment, right? That's the LCS trainer that where you're on the actual bridge. Then there's a live virtual constructive training, right? And that's the that's like an Xbox game where you can have the ship blow up in places and do things, and then you can basically see all the outcomes and affect those outcomes like with an Xbox controller, right? So my point to this, though, after you say that it's great, the Navy's only fulfilled 40% of that contract, and that's a semi-parochial thing because it's in San Diego. But I would think that you would have these virtual trainers for every bridge, for every deck, because they're so inexpensive and so much easier to train the guys and have them, fall in immediately as opposed to doing on-the-job training.
So certainly we are looking at what you call live virtual constructive. Is we kind of use that for our advanced training when we integrate ships, submarines, aircraft in a, we don't want to know if it's real, live or not. But for the specific type of technologies, we already have that in other areas, not just LCS. But I do believe that we are getting some economy with it in that we're getting better quality fidelity training and we're doing it at a better price. Okay. If you go back and look at those folks, that the same trainers that criticize computer-based training, the same types of folks that are leading this other virtual training that we're doing are like, this is the best of both worlds.
Okay,
so
let me get in. I appreciate that. Let me get in one last thing. I think Max said, or the chairman said he didn't want to get too narrow on this. I think there's a lot of things that we're blaming from forward deployed model, fleet size, maintenance schedule. This wasn't a complex, like a suppression of enemy air defense or something crazy like that. These are ships hitting other ships and running aground. And I think it's easy to obfuscate and say there's all these different problems as opposed to not seeing a ship on a radar or with your binoculars out the window. I think it's almost easy to get too carried away and not be narrow enough in this case, and I hope we just stay on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Hunter. We now proceed to Congressman Don Norcross of New Jersey.
Thank you, Chairman. And very humbling day when we go to review something like this. But having been on a job 3 times in my lifetime when somebody was killed, it immediately took me back to the thoughts that people that I worked with immediately reviewed what it is that they are doing and how can they prevent something from happening. So there was the first collision with the fishing trawler. Then there was the Fitzgerald when 7 people were killed. And I would think that every commanding officer in every ship would immediately look to see how they are performing so it didn't happen to them. And then the McCain happened. So I ask you, what's preventing the next one from happening? What is being done different today that was being done different from before the McCain accident and before the Fitzgerald?
Sir, it's a very appropriate question that, I think you're aware, we conducted an operational pause around the entire fleet. An operational pause is not something to be taken lightly. This happens in every region on the globe where we've got ships operating and those that tied up at the pier back home. It's an opportunity for commanding officers to do just what you said, to also review what lessons learned from other similar mishaps so that we give them a chance to decide, is our training where we need it to be? Are our standards as high as they should be? What do we need to do as a team to operate better as a team? Because driving ships around is incredibly team-oriented. And that's one of the things we're looking very closely at both of these investigations.
But the pause happened after the McCain, correct?
Yes, it did.
Why didn't that happen after the first collision,
Sir,
after the second collision?
Sir, it should have.
As individual COs on the ships, wouldn't they go through a self-evaluation almost immediately to say, what am I doing and how do I prevent before somebody has to tell me that?
Absolutely.
Do you know if that happened on the McCain?
I do not know exactly. We're waiting on the results of the operational pause. We asked every fleet commander to provide input back on what did they learn from that operational pause, talked about these things, who actually took some action, what kind of additional training. The commander of surface warfare sent out additional types of training for every commanding officer to use in that with their respective crews. But I do not have a list for you. I'm not sure if Admiral Boxall does. No, we do not. But we will get you one when we have it.
Finally, what is happening today differently other than the operational pause? Is there anything during the operation that you have sent out to all the commanders to say, you need to do this immediately?
Yes, sir. So Admiral Swift has already initiated several steps, several actions, to include a zero-based review of the material condition of every ship in FDNF to find out where they have issues both in the physical plant, but also perhaps with training and certification. They're going to zero-base the certifications and make sure that all of those get recertified across the force in FDNF and then expand it into entire PAC fleet. He's doing a zero-based review of the ATG manning. I'm not sure you were here when we talked afloat training group, but that is the group that goes out to the ships as an independent team to look at whether that crew is operating to our standards. And so he's going to probably ask for more resources for all of those things.
Has any of this immediate review in turn caused any ship to be returned home or to cease operating because they were in such violation?
Not to my knowledge.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
And thank you very much, Congressman Norcross. We now proceed to Congresswoman Vicki Hartzler of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. So I, like many others here, heard the news of the first accident, and I couldn't believe it. Like, how can this happen? And then to have it happen a second time, it's both disheartening and disturbing at the same time. And wanted to follow up with some of the line of questioning of a colleague, Mr. Norcross, in that, what are we doing now? And one thing you said, I mean, we knew there was a pause, but did you say that you haven't gotten the results of the pause yet, where we had the USS Fitzgerald in June had the accident? So you haven't received that yet?
The operational pause, ma'am, was taken after the McCain, not after Fitzgerald.
Okay. Okay. But you haven't received those results either. I know that's just a
no,
short
no, ma'am,
time.
not all of them.
Okay. I want to talk about the number of hours. Mr. Pendleton, you touched on that, but how much are sailors expected to work right now, and is over 100 hours out of line for that? And how do you think the Navy should address this?
Yeah, I'll defer to the admirals to talk about how much they're working now. In 2014, a Navy internal study indicated that the average sailor was working over 100 hours a week, about 108. So that meant there's 168 hours in a week. They had 100, so they were working 108 and they had 60 off. So that's about 15 and a half hours a day. The standard work week, which is founded on a 70-hour base work week, and ultimately, when they add other duties, is 81, is fairly grueling in and of itself. So if the Navy was to the standard that it has, it would the sailor would have 81 hours off and roughly 81 hours on and 87 off. So just over 11 hours a day is what's sort of programmed in.
So, Admiral Moran, is that something that you all are striving to get to, those type of numbers?
Yeah, we are examining that through, we have an organization down in Millington, Tennessee that is used to go and look at all sea duty to determine what the right work week levels ought to be. We've done this for decades. We've been pretty consistent with it, but I think based on the trend lines that we're seeing in FDNF that we referred to earlier, it's certainly time to look at whether the maintenance backload, the work effort that's going on in FDNF Japan today by sailors on the waterfront is reaching a point where that work week needs to be modified.
Great. What about, when I first heard about this, I had the thought that maybe it was cyber. Now, I've read some reports saying that perhaps that has been ruled out, but you did mention that you're going to, in this study, in the review, they're going to make sure it's eliminated. What can you tell us about that? How do you go about eliminating that somebody took over your systems?
It's relatively new ground for us. This is the first time we've sent a team from our Cyber Command here in Washington, Commander 10th Fleet, sent a team over there to pull as much data from that ship as possible that records data to see if there were any disruption or interruptions that are abnormal. I would also offer to you that just about every three-letter agency in Washington, D.C. has looked to see if there were indications of an intent or potential acknowledgement of a cyber attack. I have personally not seen any evidence of that. But we're not stopping there. The team is in place in Singapore today, has been for several days, capturing all of the computer and network information to see if they can find any abnormalities or disruptions. Okay.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and in some ways it would be easier if you could blame somebody else rather than taking the hard look at, maybe it's just that we need more training and it's our own policies and procedures that need to be addressed. But the last thing is that, I take very seriously, as do all fellow members, of appointing our young men and women to your service academies, and the Naval Academy is just exemplary. But it's always a very sobering, but inspiring as well, event when I have the parents and the young men and women come that are going to have this opportunity. But it's sobering the fact that I look into the eyes of those parents, and while they're very, very proud, many times I see a little bit of fear in the back too. What's going to happen to my son or daughter? And so this is a tough question, but Admiral, from a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being 100% confident that when we send this young man or woman out to sea, that they're going to have the resources they need to come home safe, not from an enemy, but from our own equipment and our own readiness. How confident are you that you would tell me so I can go home to my parents and look them in the eye and say they're going to be okay?
Tough question to answer. How I will answer it, is that I have incredible confidence in this team to learn from this and to get it right. And I would share that with any parent that's got a son or daughter who is considering the Naval Academy or enlisting in the service. We're not perfect, but we need to strive to be that. And that's part of what this review is all about, is to make sure we understand what went wrong and fix those things to the best of our ability to regain the confidence of not only our parents and their families, but our sailors as well.
Absolutely. They deserve that, and I know we all stand ready to partner with you to do whatever we need to do to get this right so our sailors come home safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Hartzler. We now proceed to Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, Mrs. Eccles, for being here. Thank you very much. Admiral Moran, one of the things that you said is troubling to me, and as you know, the GAO report in 2015 had a certification. It looked at about, I think, 22 areas. 11 were found to be, I guess, expired. And the one that seems to be appropriate for what happened is the mobility seamanship, where 8 certifications out of 11 had expired for about 73%. What I'm first curious about is we have to look at these 2 collisions, and they are really with commercial vessels, large commercial vessels, the tanker for McCain, and then, of course, the container ship for the Fitzgerald. I'm curious as to whether part of the training that they receive, and you said it yourself in your testimony, it is very congested in these areas than they were 2 years ago. Just the amount of traffic, and we all know the Asia Pacific area has just grown, and the amount of commercial traffic that we're dealing with is different. And it's sort of the tension between commercial plus military. And I'm pretty sure our ships don't go out and advertise that they're going out. So what is it that is done in terms of the training of our sailors as to how to prepare when they're, it's not whether you can aim the missile correctly or anything like that. This is different. This is just being in like on the freeway. How are you going to manage that? Is that something that we have sort of overlooked? We're so busy training them on cybersecurity and radar and everything else that we miss the fundamental types of issues like how to navigate?
We're asking the same question, and I think I know Admiral Davidson is going to look very hard at that in this comprehensive review. But you're absolutely right. We've moved from a country road to 395 going south right now in places like the Singapore Straits, in the Red Sea, and other areas where we need to be as a Navy. But it is, I'd offer Admiral Boxall, who's been there and driven ships in that region, maybe he could comment on that as well.
Absolutely. The regions has gotten much more difficult to navigate. There's no question. But to your point of we ought to be able to do that there anywhere all the time. And we absolutely agree with you there and why we're so committed to getting this right. We have, to your question on the certification specifically, there's 2 certifications that I think come most to mind when you look at our ability to safely navigate. One is MOB-D, MOB-N, mobility navigation, and the second one was mobility seamanship. The seamanship looks mostly at deck evolutions. Those are how do you tie up the ship, how do you use boats and things like that. The navigation one is absolutely critical, and why, if you look, most of those are done first when the ships come out. We have a tiering concept now that focuses on those skill sets, and even if in the GEO report, he'll let you know that the Tier 1 are less expired than the Tier 2 warfighting. Right. We probably need to look more closely at, there might be a Tier 0, ones that never go out, and these are the types of things that we need to look very closely. That's what I sense. I've been in those waters. I had a carrier strike group there, but I've done it as an ensign off the Singapore Strait, and I'm shocked at the difference between those 30 years of my career. It's like 2 different worlds. So this does, we are preparing for a lot of other missions as we return to sea control. But if nothing else, reminds us of our absolute imperative to get mariner skills right, we are committed 100% to doing that, and we will do whatever it takes. And that's what Admiral Davidson will make that a fundamental part of his investigation.
And I guess I'm almost out of time, but how do you prepare for that? It's like learning how to drive, right? You got to be on the road, and you got to do it. There's no, I guess, replacement for that. So is there an idea how you're going to train your sailors to do that?
Absolutely. I have a teen driver also. I use this analogy. My teen driver next month will be able to drive anywhere in a car, according to the state, not according to his dad. So there is the same type of process. We got to give them the basic tools. We've got to train them together, and someone, and this is what we'll look at, has to ensure that they meet a standard, not just that officer, but the team to keep that team safe. It's not just that one radar operator. It's not just the lookout. It's not just the person driving the ship. It is the team, the ability to communicate that data, to keep situational awareness, and keep that ship out of danger. We owe nothing less to those sailors.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
And thank you, Congresswoman Hanabusa. We now proceed to Congressman Bradley Byrne of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I was listening to you, Admiral Moran, about the difficulties presented to you when we pass a continuing resolution. Last July of this year, the House of Representatives passed an appropriations bill. Last year in the appropriations bill, we appropriated $38 billion for operation and maintenance for the Navy. The Navy requested a $7 billion increase this year. In our appropriations bill that we passed in July, we plussed it up another $500 million above your request. So the House of Representatives appropriated the money for fiscal year 18 that you need for your readiness. The response we've gotten back today from the United States Senate is a 90-day continuing resolution. Let me read from your prepared testimony and ask you to respond to that in light of your statement. Funding at prior year levels through a continuing resolution not only disrupts the gains, it begins to reverse them. Are you telling us that a continuing resolution actually reverses the gains you're attempting to make in readiness for the United States Navy?
What I mean by that, Congressman, is that when we cannot put ships on contract for avails, and we were on a recovery path,
right,
and we no longer can stay on that recovery path, we're reverting back to a different plan, a different ramp.
But that's as a result of a continuing resolution as
Yes, sir.
opposed to actually appropriating.
Yes, sir.
Right.
That's correct.
So explain in a little more detail exactly how does a continuing resolution disrupt that or reverse that? What is it in your process that causes a problem with?
Well, if you can't put an avail that you've told a yard that they're going to get on contract because there's the limits of our continuing resolution rules do not allow us to put those new contracts in place until we have a budget, then that yard has got to do something with its workforce. And when we do get the money and go back to contract in the next quarter, it's going to be less efficient and it's going to be far more, well, I won't use that word, but it'll be more expensive because they've had to make adjustments. They've had to move work around. They've maybe had to let people go in and hire them back. So those are some of the impacts in disrupting the yards that are trying their hardest to help the Navy get better in terms of eating away at that mountain of backlog maintenance that we all know is out there. And they've done a terrific job over the last year. And thanks to Congress's support in the RAA in 17, we were able to put $1.6 billion immediately on contract to bring avails back into 17, which we were planning now to have to defer into 18, only to have them deferred again. So that's the disruption I'm talking about. And Ron, if you wanted to add anything to that?
No, sir. That's
He's the guy that pays the money when you appropriate it, so well, it's important.
We appreciate what you both do. Let me go back to the administration's request for fiscal year 18. The administration requested the construction of 9 new ships for fiscal year 18. In the House passed NDAA we passed earlier this summer, we authorized the construction, and our appropriations bill followed this, for the construction of 13 ships. So I think, listening to your prior answers to Mr. Whitman's questions, I think you would agree with me, it's better for us to be finding the extra money to buy those extra ships than to stick with what the original request was. I think you'd agree with that.
I would agree we need a larger Navy.
Yes,
sir.
But to get there, we have to spend more money.
Yes, sir, because the trade-offs we're having to make, I think, are pretty apparent. And most of those trade-offs involve readiness, training, and manpower. When you buy ships or you prioritize ships, those are the trade-offs you got to make inside a limited control on your top line.
Well, Admiral, there was a lot of talk about what's your responsibility in all of this. Congress bears a responsibility in all of this. If these accidents tell us anything, It's that we can't wait to build up our fleet. We need to start now. And so I was proud to vote for that appropriations bill and our authorization bill earlier this year. I'm disappointed that the Senate has chosen to send us a continuing resolution instead of making an appropriations bill. But I believe you can count on the members of this committee continuing to do everything we can to provide you with what you need, not only to defend America, but to keep our sailors safe in doing so. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Byrne. We now proceed to Congressman Anthony Brown of Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too believe that Congress has a responsibility to fully resource our armed services. In fact, I'll go so far as adopt and associate myself with General Milley's comments, and I paraphrase that continuing resolutions, and I'll add sequestration, is comparable to legislative malpractice. But also, Admiral Moran, I want to thank you for acknowledging, and Mr. Courtney pointed it out, and I'm reading from your statement, this is not about resourcing, it is about safety, and it is about leadership at sea. Something is wrong. In a few months, 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers, 17 lives. I represent the 4th Congressional District in Maryland. 3 of those 17 young men were Marylanders. Alex Martin, Kevin Bushell, and Timothy Eccles, whose mother was here today. Something is definitely wrong. In my 9 months as a member of the House Armed Services Committee, I think I've lost count at the number of times that senior leaders from all services have come to this committee and said that we are ready to fight tonight. I don't think that these collisions are consistent with that claim. And regardless of the op tempo or the resource constraints, whether you have a 250 or 350 ship fleet, whether the defense budget is $550 or $650 billion, we all have a responsibility. And yours is to manage those resources in a way where readiness is not exclusive or mutually exclusive with safety. I thank you for your leadership, and I understand and I acknowledge that you get that. So here's my question, and it's been touched on earlier. Admiral Moran, in your written testimony, you identified cybersecurity afloat and ashore as a significant readiness shortfall that was helped by the fiscal year 17 additional appropriation. So that's good. You've identified as a shortfall. You came to Congress, and Congress helped. Can you elaborate on the progress that the Navy has made to improve cybersecurity on our forward deployed naval forces? And are the forward deployed naval force cruisers and destroyers and their control systems currently equipped to defeat cyber threats?
Congressman, I would appreciate an opportunity to come and bring that to you in a more classified setting. It deserves that kind of detail. Otherwise, I'm just going to gloss over it here, and it won't be satisfying.
No, and I appreciate that, and I would hope that through committee staff and my personal staff that we can do that, because, look, I was on the USS Nimitz 4 or 5 months ago. I went to the Command Information Center. I visited the bridge. There's a lot of floating technology. There's a lot of networking, ship to ship, ship to air, ship to shore. It's not a floating city. It's a floating state. Tremendous technological assets. And the first thing that came to my mind when I read about the first incident of 2 large vessels colliding with one another is, how does that happen? And I think as my colleague from California said, you know, sure, we talked about certification and training and maintenance, but we're talking about men and women on a bridge with equipment and technology to see on the open seas. How does that happen? So I would really like to have a better understanding of the cyber vulnerabilities, our defense, our security when it comes to our floating vessels. I mean, because I've got to believe, and I'm glad to hear that you're including that in the investigation, that your surface vessels, your aircraft are just as vulnerable to cyber attacks that are going to be disruptive in combat and non-combat operations. I certainly welcome the opportunity to hear more. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Brown. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York.
I want to associate thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate my questions with a follow-up to my colleague, Mr. Brown. I, too, think it's incredibly important that we receive a briefing in a classified setting regarding the cyber threats to our naval ships. But I want to ask you specifically, you mentioned that we are integrating cyber and network vulnerabilities as part of our ongoing investigation. How is that happening specifically, even if it is just to rule out cyber as a potential cause?
Specifically, Admiral Gilday, Vice Admiral Gilday at 10th Fleet is our Fleet Cyber Command. He has a team that he's formed that will go, they're a team of experts, I mean, very, very talented young men and women that are in place and will use their knowledge of how they would attack to determine whether we've been attacked. And they'll know where to go look. This is the first time we've done this. And we're not stopping this is to try to institutionalize doing cyber as part of any mishap, aviation, submarine, you name it. We need to go look at it as an order of business and not hand wave it to it's cyber.
Yes,
so that's where we're headed.
I agree with that, and that leads to my next question. You mentioned that you're institutionalizing this process. This is the first time that cyber has been integrated. Is that service-wide? Is that going to be a part of any future investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you describe other activities the Navy is institutionalizing, like Task Force Cyber Awakening and CyberSafe, to up our game when it comes to protecting our critical tactical platforms from cyber threats?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. What other activities is the Navy institutionalizing, such as Task Force Cyber Awakening and CyberSafe, to increase our cybersecurity when it comes to protecting our tactical platforms?
Yes, great question. So those efforts weren't started and completed. We continue to work through several of the discoveries during Task Force Cyber Awakening, as an example. One of the journeys that we're on right now that our CNO, John Richardson, has really brought forward is this notion of understanding all of the digital connections that are resident within every system we have out there today. And they're not connected as well, and we are not able to operate them as effectively as we should. That's also driving, when you dive into it that deeply, you also realize that there's a cyber component to trying to make the Navy more digitized, because it could become vulnerable more quickly unless you protect those digital databases and the ability to do analytics and those sorts of things. So again, when we come over to brief you on the classified level, we will show you what we did with the money that Congress gave us at the end of this year in fiscal year 17, where we applied it, to what defensive systems and protections that we needed to do. And in some cases, it's fundamentally basic things like shifting to the new Windows across the board, where we're getting commercial protection that comes with that product, as opposed to living off of older Windows versions on older gear that are very vulnerable without that protection.
Sure. Just to use that example, there is a sense of urgency to this. Technology is changing. If an example is making sure that you have the updated version of Windows, we need to do better in terms of addressing this.
And the Department of Defense has mandated that across the services. So all of us are responding to this. We have a deadline. It's coming up, and I can only speak for the Navy, but we are on track to meet that deadline on things as basic as what you just described.
Thank you very much, Admiral Moran, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Stefanik. We now proceed to Congressman John Garamendi of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleagues for delving into this issue of cybersecurity. Admirals, and we thank you for all of your service and for being on top of this. The loss of life is of great concern to all of us, and our hearts go out to all the families. The question of cyber is much more than hacking. The single point of failure of most everything is GPS. I assume you'll be looking at the downgrading of GPS that can occur rather easily, particularly in those areas where there happen to be other folks around. So I'd like to have that as part of that review. Also, the electronic equipment, not specifically with regard to hacking or cyber, but rather its validation that it's actually working as it is supposed to. The navigation equipment, all of the radar and so on. I assume that the review will be in that area as well as the cyber area. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay. And I would suggest that the companies that built that equipment not be the ones responsible for certifying that it's actually working. Might think about that. Also, the commanders, the commanding officers of the ship, how often are they moved from one ship to another? What is the length of time that they spend on any one ship?
As a commanding officer?
Yeah, the top three officers.
Okay, top three officers. So the executive officer on the destroyers, right now we're on a model that has the executive officer fleeting up to be the commanding officer, which gives, the intent was to build continuity to ensure that there's a clean turnover. So that's about that tour is about 18 months. There's a short break in the middle to kind of get them a little bit of head clearing, and then they go back to the same.
On the same ship or to a new ship?
On the same ship.
And the commanding officer?
The commanding officer will, after they leave, will go ashore usually or to another at-sea job, and then they'll be up for a major command job on a cruiser, for example, or a big deck amphib or a major command level ship.
I have a general concern about the way in which the military moves people from one job to another within very, very short periods of time. The concern is that it was the previous guy that's responsible and left the problem, and it's not really solved. I've seen this in other areas. I'd like to have a fuller discussion about whether that cycle is too fast and nobody is around long enough. I'm pleased to hear that the executive officer stays with the ship or
Yes,
not.
Sir. Yeah, the executive officer usually stays with the same ship. Sometimes there's an anomaly, but for the most part. But we're looking at the whole training model, not just the commanding officer level, but also at the division officer level. We do rotate ships. There's advantages to doing it in that you get different perspectives. There's also disadvantages in that you lose continuity on that ship. This is something that Admiral Davidson, we believe, will address as he looks at the training paths of those that ultimately command those ships. Command of those ships is critical, and obviously we want to make sure that they have the most qualifications they can have.
When the final reports come back, I assume we will have another hearing on the final reports, and that'll be informative. My final question really goes to a piece of testimony earlier having to do with virtual training facilities. You specified the LCS as a successful virtual training program. I assume that's a bridge that's virtual. Could you go into that for the next minute and talk a little more about that and how that might be expanded, if in fact it's as good as you say it was?
Well, again, we're looking at the feedback from people using it and then from the fleet. So again, this is not all done virtually. We still do real live, just similar to how a pilot will get simulator time and then they'll get, what's different is that we can create a virtual environment. We don't have to have the level of feel and touch that an aviation helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft will have to use. So this technology is out there. The sailors are comfortable with it. They understand it. And perhaps we can use that to continue to improve these skills where we may not have the dedicated at-sea time to do so while the force is working very hard to meet its commitments.
Those virtual experiences have proven to be very successful in the airframe operations. And further discussion on that would be useful, and your report, I suppose, will deal with that as a potential training asset. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Garamondi. We now proceed to Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I want to revisit two lines of questioning, hopefully without being repetitive. I think one of my colleagues mentioned the 2015 GAO study that found the Navy was only able to meet 44% of requests from combatant commanders to meet operational requirements. At the time, the Navy indicated that it would require over 150 more ships to fully meet all COCOM demands. So my question is, has that number changed? If so, what is the number now, and what fleet size would that correspond to?
Sir, I do not know whether the number's changed. It's probably gone up, not down. So I will do some research and get back to you if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just think, obviously, the reviews are underway, and we really appreciate your commitment to getting a thorough understanding of what happened, but I suspect when the dust settles, the simplest conclusion will remain that we've placed an enormous amount of stress on the fleet. So I think the question we need, and I know that Chairman Thornberry alluded to it earlier, the question we need to answer is, what is the right number of ships you need in order to avoid placing that stress on the force and avoid tragic accidents like that? And I think you'd have a variety of people here on this committee that are committed to making the argument for that number. And I think we forget that the 355 number that we throw out so often is indeed a minimum based on the requirements that the COCOMs are seeing out there. Separately, there was a talk about the 10-year hiatus for surface warfare officers and training, and I'd just like to dig a bit into what appears to be the relative deprioritization of surface warfare in the Navy. It's been about 10 years since a SWO commanded the Pacific Fleet and 9 years since a SWO commanded the 7th Fleet. Isn't the Navy's traditional policy to rotate these commands so that standards are upheld amongst the surface, submarine, and aviation communities?
At this level, at the 3- and 4-star level, we pay less attention to what community device you're and what community you're from than we do at experience level, judgment, and you know, in very simple terms, best athletes for the job. Mm-hmm. It is, of course, would be ideal if we had an even spread all the time, but that often gets disrupted by some of the other issues we've been dealing with here for the last several years that I think you've read about that have put a real squeeze on the talent level that's available because of ongoing investigations. So hopefully that ends here real soon and we'll be back to more of a steady state.
Sure. So it would be fair to say that if we have concerns that there's no qualified surface warfare officers available to relieve the Vice Admiral, I forget the last name, apologize.
Yeah.
From your perspective, that's less of a concern because the particular heritage of that officer, their community, matters less than their overall fitness.
Yes, sir. Admiral Sawyer, who we put in to 7th Fleet, he was already designated to go there. This clearly near the end of his predecessor's tour, so he was already confirmed by the Senate. But here's an officer, as a submarine officer, that operated extensively in 7th Fleet as not only a commander, but as a junior flag officer, but also as the deputy fleet commander in PAC Fleet. So enormous experience and credibility in that region. So it was, I mean, we looked at that much more than we did at the fact that he was a submariner.
Is it not true, though, that if you look at more broadly at Navy leadership from a historical perspective, there is a relative dearth of surface warfare officers at present at the highest levels of service?
Well, we have Admiral Davidson and Admiral Howard as 2 4-stars leading our Navy in critical places around the force. We have 3 stars in very important places throughout the Navy. So I wouldn't call it a dearth, Congressman, but I would call it maybe less than our average for this point in time.
Got it. And finally, I just would like to echo what my colleague from Alabama said about our responsibilities here in Congress to provide you with the funds that you need in order to do your job. And, you know, in light of the job that we're asking your sailors to do every single day, and, you know, a lot of this goes unnoticed, right? Because, you know, the majority of what you do in uniform is actually not high-end combat. It's waging peace. I just really feel that we need to step up to the plate and do a better job here in Congress to end defense sequester and begin the process of rebuilding the Navy. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. This is important.
Yeah.
I yield.
Congressman, if I could just, for the record, Admiral Kurt Tidd, a surface warfare, is Commander Southcom, a combatant commander as well. So, sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Gallagher. We now proceed to Congressman James Langevin of Rhode Island.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, I want to thank you for your testimony today. The incidents involving the USS Fitzgerald and the McCain were tragic events, and I wish we had never gotten to this point. My thoughts and prayers are with the families of those who are lost and those who are injured, and we're all anxious to get to the bottom of what happened. But this appears to be a symptom of a larger problem. I know we've touched this in many different capacities here today, but the U.S. Navy has, in my understanding of all of this, has moved training out of the schoolhouses and instead embraced an on-the-job training model, which has left sailors to really operate with little sleep and without a singular focus on learning. So, in an attempt to meet a high op-tempo demanded by the Navy, which only continues to increase, we've made structural choices that have left us with insufficient shoreside training infrastructure and really hindering our ability to keep our sailors safe, in my view. Would you agree with this assessment, and how do you believe we can reinvigorate training initiatives to make sure that any incidents such as these are not of our own making? And I guess...
yes, sir. I'll take that if you don't mind. The Surface Warfare Officer School, obviously, in the great state of Rhode Island, is an absolute core place where we achieve our competencies from division officer all the way up to major command and further. We were going to look at that training as I said before. We did take the schoolhouse training for division officers out of Surface Warfare Officer School and move them to a Surface Warfare Officer School in the home ports where they're going. So we took that 16 weeks of training we used to go when I went there, when I was an ensign, versus the 16 weeks we do in a 9 plus 5 and 6 model we're on right now. So I think to your point of what else can we do, I think the review will look at that, whether we need more and improved and a more capacity of training in the schoolhouse, whether it be on the waterfront or up in Surface Warfare Officer School. And, again, I think we'll have more information when we see the outcome.
Thank you. Mr. Pendleton, do you have anything to add?
Not really, sir. That's not something we looked at specifically, the schoolhouse training. What we pointed out was with respect to the forward deployed naval forces, is they were just so busy that they didn't have dedicated training time. So most folks arrived. We heard when we went on ships and did focus groups that the fact that sailors would arrive green and untrained put a burden on the sailors that were already there, and we heard that consistently.
Thank you. Admiral Moran and Admiral Boxall, I also fear that the current op-tempo is not sustainable, but that we seek to sustain it to the detriment of training and certification requirements. Now, recent reports indicate a large margin of separation when it comes to training and certifications between U.S.-based cruisers and destroyers versus forward-deployed naval forces. So were there any indications or warnings that the forward-deployed naval forces op-tempo was leading to a train on the margins scenario and not meeting qualifications or certification standards for key surface warfare systems?
Sir, it's a great question and one that Admiral Davidson will absolutely look at in his comprehensive review. What did we miss? What should we have seen earlier to address them in order to prevent the trends that were already starting earlier with Antietam, for example, and Lake Champlain that preceded both Fitzgerald and McCain? So we've got to get after this question about why didn't we see these trends earlier? Why didn't we take more action much earlier than now, for example? So it's a fair question and one that Admiral Davidson will look at.
Good. Well, I know that the review is also looking at any potential cyber vulnerabilities. I've had a chance to speak directly with Admiral Gilday about this from 10th Fleet, something that first came to mind when I heard of the incident. I hope that is not the case, but I also think that we're going to get to the bottom of the training issue. So I appreciate your due diligence on the review, and we're going to continue to focus on this as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. We now proceed to Congressman Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the members, especially Chairman Wilson, Chairman Thornberry, for allowing a non-committee member to be here today. And I really want to say a special thank you to the HASC staff. They helped connect my office at a very difficult time for one of the families in my district after the loss of Petty Officer Logan Palmer, one of the sailors on the John S. McCain. That's why I'm here today. I'm here because I appreciate what my colleagues on this committee are doing to urge the Navy and urge our military to investigate what caused these tragic accidents and what caused the tragic accident that took the life of my constituent, Mr. Palmer. We're never going to forget the service that our sailors have provided or their sacrifice. And we're praying for all their families, the friends, and also the shipmates during this difficult time. And it's up to us as Congress to allow you the opportunity and the resources to fully investigate why these accidents have occurred. I really, getting here at the end of the hearing, I've been able to listen to so much and so many questions that I would have had, be it the issue on a possible cyber attack that my colleague from Missouri brought up, be it the sequestration issue and the funding issue that we in Congress need to do a better job of addressing so that our military, each and every one of you who are leading our young sailors, you have the resources that you need to not only investigate what happened, but also to ensure that it never happens again to any of us and any of the families that have been affected. So we want to provide you those resources, and we want to do a better job on our end. But throughout this process, which was a first for me to be so engaged with a family who lost one of our heroes, and I want to ask you about what maybe you can do as a military to do a better job of serving those families during these difficult times. I didn't have the best experience working with the Navy, and again, very appreciative of the HASC staff for their intervention. And the families didn't have the best experience. While the personnel was very good at getting answers, it just seemed like it took a lot longer than what I would have imagined. It was very bureaucratic, and it just getting information on Logan took too much time, and it involved way too many people. What can be done or is actively being done to help the families have a better, more streamlined process when tragedies like this occur? Because, again, my first experience, Palmer's first experience, while it was good, could have been a lot better.
Sir, I don't think there's anything that anybody could have said today that would have made us feel any worse than to hear that a family member experienced something less than this sufficient amount of service that we owe those families. So I'll take that on personally. I promise you that we will fix whatever issues came up with the Palmer family. But I will tell you that we all appreciate your personal involvement in helping get some of that information for the Palmers. We know we fell short on transportation issues. We know we fell short in some cases on announcing that missing sailors had been found before we got to the families. We know that the social media environment that we're in works inside of our ability to move information around to those who need it first. Our focus has always been, ever since both of these tragedies, has always been first and foremost the families. And we thought we were doing a pretty good job, but from time to time we didn't meet our own standard. And I'm afraid to say the Palmers were one of them, and I regret that, and I apologize for it.
Well, I appreciate your regret. I appreciate your willingness to work together. Let us help you make the steps even better. I don't want to see any family not get any answer. Granted, I know you had a lot of good people working this case. I will tell you, I was probably most concerned that an outside organization had to pay for the flights of the family to go see their son's body return to Dover Air Force Base.
Well, it wasn't that they had to pay for it, Congressman. It was that we did not get the government to move as fast as we should have.
So the government does have a process.
Yes, sir, they do.
That's not a requirement to go to an outside.
No, sir, it is not.
So yes, thank you for agreeing to do a better job to make sure those families who may not live as close as others.
Absolutely.
So they have the opportunity to get to that point to see their loved one return for the sacrifice that entire family's made. So
and for them to be with the loved ones and crewmates of their fallen sons and husbands in the location where that crew is going to memorialize their fallen, and we're doing that.
I appreciate your service. I appreciate your recognition of the issues, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
And thank you, Congressman Davis, for your compassion for the family. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank the committee for their allowing my colleague, Mr. Davis, and I to join in today's proceedings. I, too, lost a constituent, Navy sonar technician, 3rd class, Nok Trung Nguyen, on the Fitzgerald. It was his birthday. And the family basically surmised by checking his Facebook feed, and when the responses to his birthday wishes stopped coming, they began to worry. And that's the era we live in now. That's the era we live in now. So my focus, also as a member of the Veterans Committee, is thinking about what we owe those who serve. And so my focus is very much going to be on the human side, not so much the equipment, but rather the human side, because much of what has been reported on today has to do with training, with leadership, and a culture of safety. And I say this as a daughter of a Navy man who insisted on great discipline in our household, and it does make me think about what we can do better, as so many of my colleagues have said, that we owe it as members of Congress to provide you with those resources. We need to ask you to say when we're asking too much with what you have, and to be willing and able to say, we cannot do what you are asking us to do without putting the lives of men and women at risk. And we need to know that from you. And I understand that's against your culture, but it is required because of the commitment these young people have made to this country. So that is unfair that we put you in that position, and sequester and continuing resolutions has made that worse. But it makes it all the more important that you stand up for them and for this country and for their safety. So that's one. I look at the safety culture and think about the importance of leadership from the top. These incidents, I note, seem to have occurred in the wee hours of the morning. I wonder if that's an over-reliance on equipment and technology with very young sailors who may be concerned about and not have the experience with how heavy the shipping lanes are. So I think the heaviness of the shipping lanes suggests we maybe need to do different training, but also a safety culture of if you have any doubt whatsoever, anything that seems not right, you must immediately notify right up the chain of command. Do not worry that you are waking someone up. Do not worry that you've never seen this before, and it is your 2nd week on the job. So I think if you have a safety culture that might empower our young sailors, and then go to the training of those young sailors, the notion that they are working 100-hour work weeks is really terrifying for them and for us. And it makes me think about what happened in medicine when we looked at the death rates with new interns who are working in hospitals and working very long shifts. It got so bad that states began to pass laws prohibiting longer work weeks. So again, I think that's something you need to look at, the capacity of people to operate under pressure with those kinds of hours. It's simply unfair to them, it's unsafe, and it's wrong. And we need to do our job with providing you the resources, but again, we can learn from other areas like medicine, where again, you're talking about young people who are working very long hours and being given enormous responsibility. So I hope we can learn from the checklist manifesto and other areas which could help save lives here. So those were really kind of my thoughts about what we can do, but also what we may all collectively need to do to protect the lives of these young people. And I think about this as the aunt of a nephew who's training to be a SEAL and is in process of that right now, of the young men and women who come to us, who we are honored, as colleagues have mentioned, to nominate to the academies, who hope to make their way to the ranks of commanding officers. And we owe it to all of them to do a better job. So I hope you heard from all of us. We're not looking to assign blame, but we are looking to correct this as rapidly as possible. And then to be honest with the American public about what those demands are and what resources are necessary to meet them. So again, I want to thank you for your service, but it is urgent that we address this immediately, and we owe it to the families who are here today, the families who are unable to join, and the traumatized shipmates of those, and those who went back into those ships to try to retrieve their friends and their comrades. So again, thank you very much, and again, many thanks to the HASC committee for their hard work and assisting those of us who are not on the committee in trying to do our jobs for our constituents. Thank you, and I yield back.
And Congresswoman Esty, thank you very much for your positive comments and input today. Two brief questions from me, and then we'll proceed to my other colleagues here, and then we'll be concluding. But Mr. Pendleton, how do you believe that you'll be able to determine when the services are achieving readiness recovery?
Mr. Chairman, we're doing a broader body of work, essentially monitoring the readiness recovery efforts. We made a series of recommendations in September of last year, basically saying that the Department of Defense needed a readiness rebuilding plan that matched the priority it was claiming that it had, that said what the goals were and when they would be achieved and what it would take in terms of money and time, and that there needed to be agreement on it from the top. Because what we saw when we looked at it in depth was all the services were pursuing individual plans in zeal, but not necessarily being pulled together in a department-wide plan. So what we're looking for is it clear what the goals are and how are we doing against those goals. In the case of the Navy, Admiral Moran mentioned it, they had a glide path that got them to close to where they wanted to be at some point in the future that was classified. And our concern was the glide path didn't necessarily constitute exact goals. So he mentioned earlier, this is going to knock them off the glide path. So being able to articulate the impacts of the decisions that you make, if you continue with demands and that kind of thing, that's the way we're going to look at it, sir.
Well, again, thank you. And I just have to reiterate again how professional and independent your reports have been and so helpful for members of Congress and our military. And speaking of a plan, Admiral Moran, do you believe that we have an effective plan for readiness recovery to erase the maintenance backlogs, to restore the manning shortfalls, to allow the Navy to meet the critical operational requirements, again, without risking the lives of our sailors?
We do have a plan. We think it's an appropriate plan for recovering all the areas you just talked about, buying down the maintenance backlog, getting our manpower in the right place. We must have some stability in the budget so that we can follow through on those plans. If we're constantly changing it year after year, quarter to quarter, it makes it difficult to assess our baseline. So I think we have a much better understanding of what it's going to take to recover in CONUS than clearly we understand what it's going to take to recover in FDNF, and that's what we have to get after.
And with the accidents, is the technology available to maintain and determine the perimeter of vessels so this won't happen again?
We have a lot of systems that do it. contribute to the information that's available to the team on the bridge in CIC and elsewhere. What we have to do is really examine, and Admiral Boxall's talked about this, the integration of those systems, and do we have all of that information being provided to multiple sets of eyes on that bridge at any given time.
Well, that's so important for Navy and military families. Chairman Rob Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Boxall, I want to go back to you and get some definition about time versus resources. The Navy asked for $1 billion to be reprogrammed into maintenance and modernization accounts, and now says that in 2018, those accounts will be fully funded. We know what happens with a CR, but let me get to a more fundamental question, and that is time versus resources. Understanding those situations, are we in a situation of having the proper resources going forward to get all of the modernization and maintenance work done to make sure we have the full capability so that mission certifications can be gained on time? And do we have the time to do that? So I just want to get your perspective on time and resources and where you see it going forward to get to where we need to be based on the inadequacies we see today.
Sure. The time is critical. I think you heard that over and over again today. If we don't have the time to train, we don't have the staffs to maintain the ships to the level we need, then the maintenance goes longer, the time to train gets shorter, op tempo goes up. We get into this spiral that's not healthy. Having said all that, we also need to maintain a good path. I mean, those yard periods are for a reason. We are restoring that readiness. We've put a lot of capacity in there because we're trying to restore that readiness. Trying to do them both at the same time is having some of the effects of trimming that time available. So we need to be modernized as well. As we look at choices between readiness and force structure, a very key element of that is modernization. And year after year, we unfortunately have to make the difficult choice to delay modernization, which goes to our capability to stay up with the threats as we see them around the globe. I do worry about that, and that's something that we will continue to press forward as we continue to submit our budgets to restore readiness. Also includes that keeping up not just the capacity, but the capability that's achieved through modernization.
Yeah. When you talk about capacity and capability, let me talk about it in a different sense, and that is in the yard capacity and capability. When we talk about time, time is an element for the Navy when you have the capacity in the yards to get the work done. Then it's a matter of managing where things go. But doesn't it get to a point where there's only so much capacity and capability in a yard to where time is then not manageable by the Navy because you just don't have enough capacity to get the work done? And when that work stacks up, then there's no way that you can pipeline it. Give me a perspective about where things are with the Navy, where we are today, and capability and capacity in our yards. And I'm going to ask you in a larger perspective. I know that your OPNAV duties are there with the surface Navy, but Admiral Moran, I'll get you to pipe in too. That becomes a bigger issue when it comes to what we see with submarines and other ships in the force. It kind of cascades. But Admiral Boxall, give me your perspective from the surface Navy standpoint. I'll get Admiral Moran to add in the larger perspective of Navy, because I do think it has some reverberations there with surface Navy work.
Absolutely, sir. As you know, all surface ship availabilities and maintenance are done in the private shipyards. They want stability, as you know, and to get stability, you got to have the money there and the commitment to doing that maintenance and modernizations that so right now we're putting money into that, and we're seeing this kind of lag response in delay in building the workforce, delay in having the available private shipyard workers, and the quality of the people that those shipyards, they're all competing for the same workers. So as the workload goes up, good news story that we're restoring readiness, but we can't do it quickly enough, and we're going to get bogged down, which will put more pressure on those forces. I think that's what you're hopefully trying to get at.
Yeah, it was. And then, Admiral Moran, I wanted to get your perspective, because we're starting to see some of that reverberate over into ramping up there also with the public yards. And then there's a crossover, because the public yards and the private yards are competing for the same skilled workforce. So then, Admiral Boxall, that complicates your issue in getting throughput through the private yards.
Yes, sir. It's a tough problem, just in the talent that we've got across the yards. But On the public side, it's the only place we can do nuclear work. So it's the only place you can build and fix carriers. It's the only place for, yes, sir, go ahead, Deb.
Well, no, and I think as far as the whole scope of this goes, one of the things we've seen both with Secretary of the Navy's office and within the Navy is a roller coaster ride on throughput of work. And if we have that roller coaster ride, we won't be able to maintain capacity and capability to get the work done. So even if we do have the will and the resources, and then we make the time for this to happen, if we don't have the workforce there, or if we ask the workforce to spin up with thousands of workers and then spin down by sending them out, we're going to be in a very, very difficult situation. So I'm hopeful that as you all look at this, both in Admiral Davidson's view of what's going on, the internal review, as well as Secretary Spencer's review, that it also carries over into the courses of action to correct this and seeing what do we do to make sure that there's that capacity there that's sustainable in yards, public and private.
Yes, sir. That's a critical element of these reviews, no doubt.
Very good. Let me end with one additional question for Rear Admiral Boxall. In each of the two collisions for Fitzgerald and John McCain, these were happening during routine operations. And what we see around the world today, and you all have alluded that there are over 50,000 vessels transiting in the oceans every day. That's a lot of traffic out there. Even though the oceans are big, that's a lot of traffic. And as you point out, too, much of it is necked down into some critical areas. Tokyo shipping lanes, Straits of Malacca, Straits of Hormuz, all those areas where the Navy operates on a daily basis. What we see, too, is we have the ships that we interact with that are much less capable as far as the capability of their sensors, their situational awareness. Our warships, the best in the world, lots of sensors, lots of capability. Admiral Boxall, as you know, and going to your background, being the former ship handler of the year of their Pacific Fleet, you've got firsthand experience about what it takes to successfully handle a ship. Based on your experience, give me your perspective on where we need to go in training within that realm today, and what we need to do to make sure we're developing the best mariners for our surface force. And I know you spoke a little bit about that, but I want to get your perspective because you've been there, you've had that experience, you were there on the bridge handling that ship, have been recognized for your skill in doing that. So you have a unique perspective. I just wanted to get you to share this as we kind of close things down. I know we're going to go to Mr. Courtney too. So.
Yes, sir. I honestly, when I've heard of these incidents, I was frankly shocked. I've observed a lot of strong professionalism in the folks that I've dealt with in my strike group tour throughout the surface. So I'm not sure what that's going to find and what we're going to do and how we address those things. But to your question of how we get good at our mariner skills, we have to get back to basics. I mean, yes, we are warships with the best sensors and capabilities in the world. A lot of those aren't used for navigation, but yet our tools for navigation are good enough to do what we need to do. The question is, are we using them the best way we can? I know you're a fisherman in your past, and I know you spend a lot of time in the water, as I do, and I believe there's a fundamental skill that mariners, whether you're in a fishing boat, whether you're in a merchant vessel, or whether you're in a U.S. Navy warship, but we in U.S. Navy warships absolutely have to make that our core competency. I've had several discussions with Admiral Roden, the commander of Naval Surface Force, about this. He's as adamant as I am. I had command of a ship just like McCain and just like it, and every time I see the pictures of those sailors, I think the ones that were with me. And I know we have a lot more to do. And so I'm not sure where we go from here just yet. I'd like to see what the teams find out, and then I'm ready to go and roll up sleeves and go do whatever it takes, to include coming back here to ask you to maybe assist us as we make any changes in those recommendations.
Well, listen, I appreciate that. Appreciate your perspective, too. I know that you are extraordinarily well respected. A former employee in my office today, Commander Kevin Bossy, served under you, learned a lot, and is very complimentary of your experience there and how you pursued things. I know that you'll use that experience in what we need to do collectively to make sure that we are gaining the correct and directed seamanship skills, navigating skills with all of our officers and crew members on board our surface fleet. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rob Whitman. We now proceed to Ranking Member Joe Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses for your outstanding testimony here today. You know, I was thinking, having listened to the whole hearing about Admiral Moran's first visit to this Congress back in January, where, again, there was a lot of excitement over the force structure assessment and increasing the size of the fleet. And again, I think our committee has gotten us off to a good start in terms of the NDAA. But your testimony was, let's remember first things first. We've got to, focus on the existing fleet to make sure that, during that time that it takes to, with shipbuilding being such a long game, to get to these higher numbers, that we're still able to perform the missions of the Navy. And I think, again, those words really reverberate today in terms of just, the discussion and the incidences that we're talking about, that, focusing on what you told us to focus on is really critical to all of the goals that we're trying to achieve, which is to, do what the Navy does in terms of its missions, but also making sure that it gets done safely. And I guess, Mr. Wilson asked the question about how do we get to that level of adequate readiness, and your comment about the fact that, the forward deployed forces is still really the tough one here in terms of just how do we, achieve that. I think you said you had a pretty good vision, or the Navy has a pretty good vision about how to do it with the ships that are based in the U.S. And Mr. Pendleton, your graph on page 6 of the report, which again showed the difference between training, maintenance, and deployment and planned schedules for home U.S.-based ships versus Japan, again, really vividly shows the the sharp difference in terms of, and that sort of adds to the level of difficulty, degree of difficulty in terms of trying to solve this problem. So in the meantime, I mean, the question which we've been talking about is, who's the decision maker for the forward deployed forces while we're trying to figure this out? And I know that's probably going to be part of the Davidson study in terms of just trying to get the lines of decision making clear. But one last time, it's just, who decides, for the forward deployed fleet in terms of, man, train, and equip decisions, and the final decision to, send these ships to sea? And is it the operational admiral, or is it the forces commander?
Yeah, understandably, Congressman, this is not simple. And I think when we talk about man, train, and equip, there are many people who are responsible for that. It works its way all the way through the surface force, for example, when we're talking surface ships. Obviously, the carrier has components of aviation and so on and so forth. So there are many places and people that are responsible for adequately resourcing the manning, training, and equipping. The operational tempo, the operations, and how often those ships and what types of missions are going on, and how to prioritize the training that they do get or that they're required to get for those missions is clearly the local operational commanders in Japan. The model, though, the model that you reflect here on page 6 is a big Navy discussion. So the CNO and I and the 4-star fleet commanders have got to look at what Admiral Davidson's review finds. Is the model out of alignment for what we've asked them to do? And going forward, do we need to make adjustments? That'll be Title 10, ESH 1, if you will, responsibility to make those course corrections based on the recommendations. In the interim period, Admiral Swift is going after this to make sure as we go through the review, he's got a deeper understanding and will adjust where he needs to adjust to lower the tension, if you will, between that op tempo and the maintenance training aspects of what he's doing out in Japan.
I think that answer sheds more light in terms of the question. And again, I thought your answer, Chairman Thornberry, about the fact that the Navy made a tough call in terms of the carrier deployments. But again, it was just driven by external forces that, we had to set up a schedule and stick to it. And I think that answering the question that you just did in Admiral Davidson's report is going to help us sort of make sure that we're just not biting off more than we can chew. And I think, it kind of screams out from the report from GAO that's something we've got to understand, that 100 hours a week, deployments there's got to be sort of a way to decide when to rebalance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
And thank you very much, Ranking Member Joe Courtney. And we want to thank all of our witnesses for you being here, but also in particular for your service to the American people to protect American families. Also, it's an opportunity for us to thank the professional staff who have been here and have been so helpful. The Armed Services Committee is just blessed with remarkable people, and we're particularly blessed with Margaret Dean, because not only is she a professional staff member, but she is a very appreciated member of the Navy Reserve. So at this time, we shall adjourn.